He was just 17 when he joined the Texas Rangers, and for the next 6 years, every day could have been his last. James Gillett didn't just wear the badge, he earned it in blood. From shootouts with horse thieves and murderers to face-offs with infamous outlaws like Sam Bass and the Horrell brothers, Gillett lived the brutal, lawless reality of the Texan frontier. He fought in the Mason County War, hunted fugitives across the Rio Grande, and battled raiding Apache warriors. His life was a whirlwind of violence, loyalty, and justice at the edge of civilization. How did a teenager survive 6 deadly years with the Texas Rangers, and what kind of man walked away from it all? The campfire is ready, so stay with me tonight. The story is about to start. My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. Chapter 1. The Making of a Ranger. The greatest shaping force in human life is heredity, and from my father I inherited my love of the open frontier and its life of danger and excitement. This inheritance was further strengthened by environment and training and finally led me to embrace the life of the Texas Ranger. My father, James S. Gillett, was himself a frontiersman, though born in the quieter, more settled East. At a very early age, his parents emigrated from his birthplace in Kentucky and moved to Missouri. Here, after a short time, they died, and the young orphan lived with a brother-in-law. When still quite a youth, my father, with 3 other adventurous Missourians, set out on an expedition to Santa Fe, New Mexico. While passing through Indian Territory, now the state of Oklahoma, the little party was captured by the Osage Indians. Fortunately for the youngsters, their captors did them no harm, but turned them loose after 2 weeks' imprisonment in the Native American camp. Despite this first setback, my father persevered and reached Santa Fe. Here he lived several years and mastered the Spanish language. Not long afterward, the emigrating fever again caught him up, and he journeyed to Van Buren, Arkansas. While living there, he studied law and was admitted to the bar. Shortly thereafter, he removed to Paris, Texas, from which he was elected to the Texas legislature as representative for Lamar and adjoining counties. When Texas entered the Union and brought on the Mexican War with the United States, my father enlisted in 1846 and rose to the rank of major. In 1854, he was Adjutant General of Texas. Between 1859 and 1860, during the governorship of Sam Houston, my father was quartermaster of a battalion of Rangers, thus making it natural that I should also feel drawn toward this famous organization. At the beginning of the Civil War, my father was beyond military age. He was born in 1810, but as the South became hard-pressed for men, he enlisted in the spring of 1864 and served in Captain Carrington's company until the end of the war. In 1850, a few years before he became Adjutant General, my father married Miss Betty Harper, then a resident of Washington County, Texas. My mother's father, Captain Harper, was a Southern planter who emigrated from North Carolina between 1846 and 1848, and, settling in Washington County, established a Dixie plantation with 100 slaves. My mother was a highly cultivated and refined woman. On her marriage, she brought several black individual servants with her to her new home in Austin. Of her union with my father, 5 children were born. The first 2, both boys, died in infancy. I was the 4th child born to my parents, and first saw the light of day in Austin, Texas, on November 4, 1856. An older sister, Mary, and a younger, Eva, survived to adulthood. At the close of the Civil War, my father returned to his family pretty well broken, in health and probably also in spirit. His slaves were all freed, and his land holdings, about 200 acres of cedar land, some 5 or 6 miles from Austin, and a tract of pine land in Grimes County, Texas, were not very productive. There was not much law practice in Austin in the early post-war days, but my father set to work resolutely to provide for his family. Though I didn't realize it then, I now know that he had a hard struggle. I was only 8.5 years old when Father returned to us from the Confederate Army, but I remember he used to amuse himself by relating to us vivid accounts of his Indian fighting and frontier adventures. What heredity gave me a predilection for was strengthened by these narratives, and I early conceived a passionate desire to become a frontiersman and live a life of adventure. In those early days in Texas, there were no free schools in Austin, so my father sent the three of us, Mary, Eva, and myself, to the pay schools. None of these was very good, and I lost nearly 2 years at a German school, trying to mix German and English. I have never been of a studious nature. The great outdoors always called to me, and I found the desk's dead wood particularly irksome. When school closed in the early summer of 1868, like some of Christ's disciples, I went fishing and never attended school an hour thereafter. For books, I substituted the wide-open volume of nature and began the life of sport and freedom that was to prepare me later for service with the Rangers. As poor as he was, my father always kept a pony, and I learned to ride almost before I could walk. Raised on the banks of the Colorado River, I learned to swim and fish so long ago that I cannot now remember when I was unable to do either. I fished along the river with a few hand lines and used to catch quantities of gaspergoo or drums. These were fine fish and sold readily on the streets of Austin, so I soon saved enough money to buy a small skiff or fishing boat. I now bought a trot line with 100 hooks and began fishing in earnest. About 5 or 6 miles below Austin on the Colorado was Matthew's Mill. Just below the dam of this mill, the fishing was always good, and here I made my fishing grounds. I had a large dry goods box with inch auger holes bored in it. This box, sunk in the river and secured by a rope tied to a stob, made a capital trap, and into it I dropped my fish as they were caught. In this way, I kept them alive and fresh until I had enough to take into town. Many free black individuals were farming along the banks of the Colorado, and I would hire a pony of them for 25 cents a trip when I was ready to take my catch into town. Many times I have left the river by starlight and reached the old market house at Austin at dawn, spread out a gunny sack, bunched my fish, and been ready for the first early marketers. I kept up my fishing until the fish stopped biting in the fall of 1868. Confederate soldiers returning home from the war brought with them many old Enfield muskets. These were smooth bore and chambered 1 large ball and 3 buckshot. These old guns, loaded with small shots, were fine on birds and squirrels, but they had one serious objection. They would kick like a mule. As the boys used to say, they would get meat at both ends. A day's shooting with one of these muskets would leave one's shoulder and arm black and blue for a week. When fishing failed, I decided to become a hunter and bought one of these old guns for $3.50. It was as long as a fence rail, and at my age I could not begin to hold it out and shoot offhand, so I had to use a rest. The Enfield musket had the longest barrel I ever saw on a gun, and the hammer was as long as a man's hand. I could cock my gun with both hands, but if I failed to get a shot, I was not strong enough to let the hammer down without letting it get away, so I had to carry it cocked to keep from losing the cap. I would take it off the tube and put it in my pocket until I had a chance for another shot. I remember once when I cocked my musket I could see no cap on the tube, and thinking it had fallen off, I pulled the trigger. The cap had stuck up in the old hammer, and the gun roared like a cannon. I was always sure to look for the cap after this. I did not make much headway using this kind of weapon, but it taught me the use and danger of firearms, a knowledge I was to find very useful in later years. When fishing opened up in the spring of 1869, I returned to my fishing lines, and in the fall of the same year I bought a double-barreled shotgun for $12. With it I killed quail, ducks, and other small game, all of which I sold on the streets of Austin. By the fall of 1870, I was 14 years old and could handle a gun rather well for one of my age. Early that winter, wild geese came south by the hundreds. I used to hunt them down the Colorado River, 10 or 12 miles below Austin. The birds would feed in the cornfields in the early morning, then flock to the sandbars in the river during the middle of the day. There was nothing silly about those geese, for they were smart enough to frequent only the big islands, 300 or 400 yards from any cover. It was impossible to reach them with any kind of a shotgun. I used to slip up to them as close as I could and watch them for hours, trying to think of some plan to get within gunshot of them. I saw as many as 1,000 geese on those bars at a single time. I have thought regretfully of those birds many times since, and have wished I could have shot into one of those flocks with a modern rifle. I could have killed a dozen geese at a shot. In the spring of 1871, I had my first trip to the frontier of Texas. My father traded some of Miss Grimes County pine land for a bunch of cattle in Brown County, and took me with him when he went to receive the herd. This was the first time I had ever been 25 miles from Austin. I was delighted with the trip, the people, and the country. Those big, fine frontiersmen, each wearing a pair of six-shooters, and most of them carrying a Winchester, fired my boyish imagination. Their accounts of frontier life and their Indian tales fascinated me. I wanted to stay right there with them, and lost all interest in ever living in town again. During the same year, my father drove several bunches of cattle to Austin, and I helped him on those drives. Thus I began to be a cowboy, my first step toward the life of the open upon which I had set my heart. In the summer of 1872, my mother's health began to fail, and my father took her to Lampasas Springs. The water seemed to help her so much that he decided to make Lampasas our home. At that time, Lampasas County was strictly a cattle country, but there was not much cow hunting during the winter in those days. The cattlemen and the cowboys spent a good deal of time in town just having a good time. During this period, I became well acquainted with them. In the spring of 1873, my father made a trip back to Austin on some business. The frontier had been calling to me ever since my first visit there, and I now took advantage of my father's absence to slip out to Coleman County, at that time on the frontier of Texas. Monroe Cooksey and Jack Clayton had bought a bunch of cattle in Coleman County, and I saw the outfit when it left Lampasas. I was slightly acquainted with most of the men in this outfit, so I decided to follow it and try to get work. It was an Indian country every step of the way, and I was afraid to make the trip alone. In a day or two, I met a man named Bob McCollum. He was hauling a load of flour to Camp Colorado and let me travel with him. I bade my mother and sisters goodbye and did not see them again until the next December. We reached old Camp Colorado without mishap in about 5 days. Clayton and Cooksey's outfit was there loading up supplies for the spring work. I stood around watching the cowboys making their preparations, but lacked the courage to ask them for work. Finally, the outfit started down on Jim Ned Creek to camp for dinner. I went with the men and at last got up spunk enough to ask Mr. Monroe Cooksey for a job. He looked at me for a minute and then asked, "What kind of work can a boy of your size do?" I told him I was willing to do anything a boy of my age could do. He made no reply, and we went on and camped for dinner. After dinner, the men made ready to go over on Horde's Creek to camp for the night. The boys made a rope corral and began to catch their mounts. I just stood there like an orphan watching them. Presently, Mr. Cooksey dashed his rope on a heavy-set bay horse. The animal showed the whites of his eyes, made a rattling noise in his nose, and struggled so violently that it took 3 men on the rope to hold him. Mr. Cooksey then turned to me and said, "Here, boy, if you can ride this," giving an unmentionable name to the horse, "you have a job cinched." I turned, grabbed my saddle, bridle, and blanket, and started to pet the animal. An elderly man in the outfit headed me off. "Young man," he said, "this is an old spoiled horse, and unless you are a mighty good rider, you had better not get on him." I brushed him aside. "Pshaw, I'm hunting for work, and while I'm not a bronco buster, I will stab him if he kills me." By this time, one of the boys had caught the horse by both ears and was holding him fast. They threw my saddle on him, tightened up the cinch, and finally, after much trouble, got the bridle on him and lifted me into the saddle. When I had fixed myself as best I could, they let the animal go. He made 2 or 3 revolting leaps forward and fell with his feet all doubled up under him. Mr. Cooksey seemed to realize the danger I was in and shouted to me to jump off. Before I could shake myself loose, the old horse had scrambled to his feet and dashed off in a run. I circled him around to the remuda and rode him until night without further trouble. I had won my job, but it was a dirty trick for a lot of men to play on a boy, and a small boy at that. However, to their credit, I wish to say they never put me on a bad horse again, but gave me the best of gentle ponies to ride. Our first work was to gather and deliver a herd of cattle to the Horrell boys, then camped on Home Creek. We worked down to the Colorado River, and when we were near Old Flat Top Ranch, the men with the outfit left me to drive the remuda down the road after the mess wagon while they tried to find beef. I had gone only a mile or two when I saw a man approaching me from the rear. As he came up, I thought he was the finest specimen of a frontiersman I had ever seen. He was probably 6 feet tall, with dark hair and beard. He was heavily armed, wearing 2 six-shooters and carrying a Winchester in front of him, and was riding a splendid horse with a wonderful California saddle. He rode up to me and asked whose outfit it was I was driving. I told him Cooksey and Clayton's. He then inquired my name. When I told him, he said, "Oh yes, I saw your father in Lampasas a few days ago, and he told me to tell you to come home and go to school." I made no reply, but just kept my horses moving. The stranger then told me his name was Sam Golston. He said it was dangerous for one so young to be in a bad Indian country and unarmed, that the outfit should not have left me alone, and counseled me to go back to my parents. I would not talk to him, so he finally bade me goodbye and galloped off. His advice was good, but I had not the least idea of going home. I had embraced frontier life. The Cooksey and Clayton outfit did not stay in the cow business long. After filling their contract with the Horrell boys, they sold out to Joe Franks. I suppose I was sold along with the outfit. At least I continued to work for Mr. Franks. A kinder heart than that of Joe Franks never beat in a human breast. He was big of stature and big of soul. He seemed to take an interest in his youthful cowpuncher, and asked me where I was raised and how I came to be away on the frontier. As cold weather came in that fall, he gave me one of his top coats. It made a pretty good overcoat for me and came down quite to my knees. The sleeves were so long I could double them up and hold my bridle reins, and in one garment I had both a coat and gloves. During the summer of 1873, John Hitson's, Sam Golston, and Joe Franks were all delivering cattle to old John Chisholm, whose outfit was camped on the south side of the Concha River, about where the town of Paint Rock now stands. The other outfits were scattered along down the river, about half a mile apart. There were probably 75 or 100 men in the 4 camps, and at least 500 horses. One evening, just after dark, the Indians ran into Golston's outfit, captured about 60 heads of horses, and got away with them. The Native Americans and the cowboys had a regular pitched battle for a few moments, probably firing 200 shots. This fight was in plain view of our camp, and I saw the flash of every gun and heard the Indians and the cowboys yelling. One of Mr. Golston's men received a flesh wound in the leg, and several horses were killed. 2 nights later, the Indians ran upon Frank's outfit and tried to take our horses. Bob Whitehead and Pete Peck were on guard and stood the Native Americans off. We saved our horses by keeping them in a pen for the remainder of the night. I was beginning to get a taste of frontier life early in the game. For years, cattle had drifted south into Menard and Kinnable counties, and Joe Franks was one of the first of the Coleman country outfits to go south into the San Saba and Llano country. He worked the Big and Little Saline Creeks, the Llano and San Saba rivers, and found many of his cattle down there. By the end of November, he had finished work for the year, and gathering 300 fat cows to drive to Calvert, Texas, he left John Bannister down on the Big Saline to winter the horses. I passed through Lampasas with these cows and saw my mother and sisters for the first time in 9 months. When we reached Bell County, a cow buyer met us and bought the cows at $10 per head. He just got down off his horse, lifted a pair of saddlebags off, and counted out $3,000 in $20 gold pieces and hired some of the boys to help him drive the cattle into Calvert. Mr. Franks, with most of the outfit, turned back to Lampasas. When he settled with me, Mr. Franks owed me just $200, and he handed me 10 $20 gold pieces. It was the most money I had ever earned, and almost the greatest amount I had seen in my life. I spent December and January at home, and early in February 1874, I started back to Menard County with Mr. Franks, as he was anxious to begin work as early in the spring as possible. When we reached Parsons Ranch on the Big Saline, we learned that the Indians had stolen all his horses, 75 or 80 heads, and he had left only 8 or 10 old horses. Mr. Franks sent Will Bannister and myself back to Coleman County to pick up 10 or 12 horses he had left there the year before, while he himself returned to Lampasas and Williamson counties to buy horses. This trip from Menard County to Coleman County, a distance of about 150 miles, was rather a hazardous trip for two boys to make alone. However, we were both armed with new Winchesters and would have been able to put up a stiff fight if cornered. Our ponies were poor and weak, so that it would have been impossible for us to have escaped had we met a band of Indians. And this is what we came very near doing. There was no road from Menard to Coleman at that time, so we just traveled north. I had cow hunted over most of that country the year before and knew by landmarks pretty well how to go. We reached the head of Big Brady Creek one evening while a cold north wind was blowing. We camped for the night right down in the bed of a dry creek to get out of the wind. We saddled up the next morning and had not gone more than 150 yards from camp before we discovered where 16 or 17 Indians had just gone along. At least there was that number of pony tracks. These Native Americans had hopped a skunk, gotten down, and killed it with a chunk of wood. When we found the body, it had scarcely quit bleeding. We saw moccasin tracks as if the savages had all gotten off their ponies for a few moments. Bannister and I made the trip safely and returned to Menard County early in March. Mr. Frank soon came with a new bunch of horses, and we went right to work gathering and delivering cattle. About the 1st of June, B. Clayton came to the outfit from Lampasas County and told me my father had been dead for more than a month. Mr. Frank settled with me, and I started for home the next day. Upon reaching Lampasas, I began work with Barrett and Nichols' outfit. They were the biggest cattle owners in that country and ran 3 large outfits, one in Llano County, one in San Saba County, and another in Lampasas. I worked with the last-mentioned outfit so that I might be near my mother and sisters. I had now become familiar with most aspects of frontier life. I had cowpunched and seen Indian raids, but I had not yet met the Texas bad man, the murderer, and the bandit. My education was not long neglected, for it was while working with Barrett and Nichols that I made my acquaintance with gentry of that ilk. One day 5 or 6 of our boys were sitting down in a circle eating on a side of calf ribs. One of the men, Jack Perkins, suddenly became involved in an altercation with Levi Dunbar, and without warning jerked out his 6-shooter and shot him to death. On rising to my feet, I had my right shoulder powder burned. I stayed with Barrett and Nichols until they quit work about December 1st, 1874. In those days, cattle did not work much in the winter months, so I spent the winter at home. By spring, I had become as restless as a bear and longed to get back to the frontier. Finally, I could stand the idleness no longer and told my mother I was going back to Menard County to work for Mr. Franks. I reached the town of Maynardville early in March 1875. There I learned that Joe Franks was then at work on South Llano in Kimball County, about 60 miles from Menard. Wes Ellis had just bought the Roof Wind stock of cattle and was ready to start on a cow hunt. He wanted me to work for him, declaring he could pay me as much as Joe Franks or anybody else, so I hired him for $30 a month, the top wages for a cowboy at that time. During the year I was at home, a company of Texas Rangers commanded by Captain Dan W. Roberts had been stationed over Little Saline. This company received its mail at Maynardville, and I became acquainted with this famous organization. Their free, open life along the frontier had fired me with longing to become one of them and join in their adventurous lives. In the spring of 1875, the governor of Texas authorized Captain Roberts to increase his command to 50 men. Almost immediately, Captain Roberts announced in Maynardville and vicinity that he would enlist 20 good men on June 1st to bring his company to full strength. Here was my opportunity, and I decided I would be one of those 20 recruits. Chapter 2. The Texas Rangers. Table of Contents. The Texas Rangers as an organization dates from the spring of 1836. When the Alamo had fallen before the onslaught of the Mexican troops and the frightful massacre had occurred, General Sam Houston organized among the Texan settlers in the territory a troop of 1,600 mounted riflemen. This company, formed for the defense of the Texan borders, was the original Texas Ranger unit, and it is interesting to note that the organization from its very inception to the present moment has never swerved from that purpose, the protection of Texan borders, whether such protection be against the Indian, the bandit, or marauding Mexicans from beyond the Rio Grande. This little troop of Rangers won everlasting laurels in its stand against Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto. When the Republic of Texas was organized in December 1837, the new state found herself with an enormous frontier to protect. To the south was the hostile Mexico, while to the west and northwest roved the Indian and the bandit. To furnish protection against such enemies and to form the nucleus of a national standing army, the Ranger troop was retained. During the 7 years that Texas had to maintain her own independence before she was admitted into the American Union, her Rangers repelled hordes of Mexicans, fought the murderous Apaches, Comanches, and Kiowas, and administered justice on a wholesale plan to a great number of outlaws and ruffians that had flocked pell-mell into the new republic from the less attractive parts of the United States. So vital was the service rendered by the Rangers in protecting the lives and property of the settlers along the frontiers of the state that Texas retained 1,200 Rangers as mounted police for patrol of the Mexican border and as a safeguard against the savage Native Americans of the Southwest. When the Civil War broke out between the North and the South, Texas was drawn into the conflict on the side of the Confederacy. General Con Terry, an old Ranger, organized the famous body of men known as Terry's Texas Rangers. This command was composed almost exclusively of ex-Rangers and frontiersmen. From Bull Run to Appomattox, this Ranger troop rendered gallant service and lost 75% of its original muster roll. General Sherman, in his memoirs, speaks admiringly of the bravery of the Rangers at the Battle of Shiloh. Return to peace and the days of Reconstruction did not do away with the necessity for the service that could only be rendered by the Ranger. Banditry, Indian uprisings and massacres, cattle thievery, all flourished, for the bad man confidently expected the post-war turmoil would protect him from punishment for his misdeeds. He was to be undeceived, for the Rangers effectively taught him that they were in the state for the purpose of protecting lives and property, and right royally did they perform that duty. From 1868 to 1873, the Ranger companies were gradually reduced from 1,000 to about 300 men. The federal government adopted a most unfortunate policy toward the Indians after the war. The tribes were removed to reservations and rationed as public charges. Unscrupulous dealers, in their desire for gain, illegally sold firearms to the Indians, and whenever a Native American massacred a frontiersman, he was sure to capture good weapons, so that they soon became well armed and very expert in handling their new weapons. As no attempt was made to confine them to the reservation limits, the Native Americans, under their native chiefs, were always sneaking off and raiding West Texas. These marauders stole thousands of horses and cattle and did not hesitate to murder and scalp the defenseless people along the frontier. Numbers of women and children were carried off as captives, a very small proportion of which were subsequently ransomed. Repeated complaints to Washington brought no redress. Indeed, some of the government officials calmly declared that the Indians were doing no harm. It was white men disguised as Native Americans that caused the trouble. In 1874, conditions along the frontier had become so acute that the need for an organized mounted police for the protection of the settlers against the continued Indian raids became apparent. As in the past, the state looked again to her Rangers. Early in 1874, during the administration of Governor Richard Koch, the first Democratic governor since secession, the legislature appropriated $300,000 for frontier defense, thus authorizing the formation of the Texas Rangers as now constituted. the governor immediately issued a call for 450 volunteers. These were formed into 6 companies of 75 men each. Each of these units was offered by a captain and a first and second lieutenant. The companies were designated A, B, C, D, E, and F, and received the official name of the Frontier Battalion of Texas Rangers. Major John B. Jones of Corsicana, Texas, was commissioned major of the command. At this time, the captains received a salary of $100 per month, lieutenants $75, sergeants $50, and corporals and privates $40. Subsequently, as the legislature continually sliced into the ranger appropriation, the pay of the private was reduced to only $30 a month, a mere pittance for the hazardous service demanded of them. Early in 1874, the force took the field, and each company was assigned a definite territory along the frontier. Company A, being the northernmost company, was camped on the main fork of the Brazos River. Company F, the southernmost, was stationed on the Nueces River. The remaining 4 companies were posted along the line between the 2 commands about 125 miles apart, so that the battalion of 450 men was required to cover a frontier of between 500 and 600 miles. Major Jones was a very able commander and quickly won the confidence of his men and of the people along the border he was sent to protect. The frontiersmen cooperated with him in every way possible, sending runners to the various ranger camps whenever an Indian trail was found or a bunch of horses stolen. During the very first 6 months of its existence, nearly every company in the battalion had had an Indian fight, and some of them 2 or 3. This command finally cleared the Texas frontier of the Native Americans and then turned its attention to the other pests of the state: thieves, bandits, and fugitives from justice. In this work, the ranger rendered service second to none and became in an incredibly short time the most famous and the most efficient body of mounted police in the world. Between 1865 and 1883, the Texas Rangers followed 128 Indian raiding parties and fought the Native Americans in 84 pitched battles. During this same period, they recovered 6,000 stolen horses and cattle and rescued 3 citizens carried off by Indians. In this period, 12 Rangers were killed. Despite this record of service, the legislature at Austin could not always be made to see the advantages, nay, the necessity, for a ranger force, and it was continually tinkering with the appropriations for the support of the force. When the appropriation was small, the command was reduced to keep within the expenditure doled out by the parsimonious Solons and recruited to full strength whenever the lawmakers could be prevailed upon to increase the annual ranger budget. By 1885, conditions had changed. Texas was no longer endangered by Indians, for the Rangers had done much to convert the Red Devils into good Indians, that is, into dead ones. Although the Indians had utterly disappeared from the state, the activities of the Rangers did not cease. The white, bad man, who had stirred up the first Indian troubles, now began to plunder and murder his own race and indulge in every form of lawlessness. From hunting the murderous Native Americans, the Rangers became stalkers of the man-killers and those who despoiled their neighbors of their property. The local legal authorities could not or would not handle this task themselves, so the Rangers were made peace officers and given the right of arrest without warrant in any part of the state. They then became mounted constables to quell disorder, prevent crime, and bring criminals to justice, and assist the duly constituted authorities in every way possible. This new work was less romantic than the old Indian warfare, but it was every bit as dangerous and as necessary in the building up of the fast-developing state. As in every other task assigned to him, the Ranger did his duty fearlessly and well. Between 1889 and 1890, the Rangers made 579 arrests, among them 76 murderers. With the coming of the railroads, the Rangers began to use them, as they permitted speed and the covering of greater distances than were possible on horseback. Moreover, commands could be dispatched from one part of the state to another as occasion demanded. This greater mobility led to larger usefulness and an increasing number of arrests by the Ranger forces. The outbreak of the Spanish-American War found the Ranger ready and anxious for service in the defense of the Union. Large numbers of them were enlisted in the world-famous Rough Riders. "I have heard from the lips of reliable Rangers," declared General Miles in speaking of the Ranger service in Cuba, "tales of daring that are incomparable. It is indeed too bad that the world knows so little about those marvelous men. There have been hosts of men among the Texas Rangers who were just as nervous as Davy Crockett, Travis, or Bowie at the Alamo." Thanks to her Rangers, Texas is now one of the most law-abiding, most orderly states in the Union. And today, more than 46 years since the organization of the battalion, the state still maintains a tiny force of Rangers numbering 63 officers and men. In 1920-21, the battalion was composed of a headquarters company and companies A, C, D, E, and F. As in the beginning of its history, the force was stationed along the frontier. The headquarters company, under command of Captain J. P. Brooks, was stationed at Austin and used for emergency calls. Company A, stationed at Presidio and commanded by Captain Jerry Gray, patrols the border between El Paso, Presidio, and Jeff Davis counties and the backcountry southward. Company E, Captain J. L. Anders, patrols the line of Presidio and Brewster counties to the line of Terrell and Valverde counties and eastward. Company F, under Captain W. W. Davis, was stationed at Del Rio and covered the line from Terrell and Valverde counties down the river to the line between Maverick, Dimmitt, and Webb counties and the backcountry. Under the command of Captain William Ryan, Company C was located at Laredo and patrolled the line of Maverick, Dimmitt, and Webb counties to the line of Zapata and Starr counties and the backcountry, while Company D, stationed at Brownsville, under Captain W. L. Wright, patrols from the line of Zapata and Starr counties down the Rio Grande to its mouth and the adjacent backcountry. Sketchy as this history has been, it will show a Ranger record of continuous duty throughout the 46 years of its existence in guarding the lives, the liberty, and the property of Texas citizens. And the Ranger has been content to perform his duty unheralded and almost unsung. Performance of duty, it matters not where it may lead him, into whatever desperate situation or however dangerous the thing demanded, has always been the slogan of the organization. For courage, patriotic devotion, instant obedience, and efficiency, the record of the Texas Ranger has been equaled by no body of constabulary ever mustered. Though formed into military units and officered as a soldier, the Ranger is not a military man, for scant attention is paid to military law and precedent. The state furnished food for the men, forage for their horses, ammunition, and medical attendance. The Ranger himself must furnish his horse, his accoutrements, and his arms. There is, then, no uniformity in the matter of dress, for each Ranger is free to dress as he pleases, and in the garb experience has taught him most convenient for utility and comfort. A Ranger, as any other frontiersman or cowboy, usually wears good, heavy woolen clothes of any color that strikes his fancy. Some are partial to corduroy suits, while others prefer buckskin. A felt hat of any make and color completes his uniform. While riding, a Ranger always wore spurs and very high-heeled boots to prevent his foot from slipping through the stirrup, for both the Ranger and the cowboy ride with the stirrup in the middle of the foot. This is safer and less fatiguing on a long ride. For arms, the Ranger after 1877 carried a Winchester rifle or carbine, a Colt's .45 revolver, and a Bowie knife. 2 cartridge belts, one for Winchester and one for revolver ammunition, completed his equipment, and so armed he was ready to mount and ride. "We live in the saddle, and the sky is our roof," say the old Rangers. And this is literally true. The Rangers are perfect centaurs and almost live in the saddle. They take horses where they will and may arrest or search in any part of the state. There is very little of what a West Point graduate would call drill. A Ranger is expected simply to be a good rider and a quick and accurate shot. Every one of them are skilled horsemen and crack shots. No crack cavalryman in any army can mount a horse more quickly or more expertly than a Ranger, and he can keep a constant stream of fire pouring from his carbine when his horse is going at top speed, and hit the mark 9 times out of 10. Should a ranger drop anything on the ground that he wants, he does not even check the speed of his horse, but bending from the saddle as if he were made of India rubber, he picks up the object in full gallop. While not on active duty, the rangers amuse themselves in various ways. Some play cards, others hunt, while the studious spend their time over books and good literature. Horse racing is popular, and the fastest horse in the company is soon spotted, for the rangers match their mounts one against the other. At night, around their campfires, the men are constantly telling stories of their own, or some comrade's adventures, that put to shame all the inventions of the imaginative fiction writers. But when on duty, all this is changed. No pace is too quick, no task too difficult or too hazardous for him. Night and day will the ranger trail his prey, through rain and shine, until the criminal is located and put behind the bars, where he will not again molest or disturb peaceful citizens. For bravery and endurance and steadfast adherence to duty at all times, the ranger is in a class all to himself. Such was the old ranger, and such is the ranger of today. Is it surprising, then, that I was early attracted to the force and wished to join them in their open, joyous, and adventurous life? Chapter 3. I joined the Rangers. Table of Contents. The fame of the Texas Rangers had, of course, become common knowledge among all Texans. Their deeds of adventure and their open, attractive life along the frontier had always appealed to me, and I had long cherished the desire to enlist in the battalion. But the enlistment, as announced by Captain Roberts, would not be made until June 1, 1875, and I reached Menarville early in March. I had intended on joining Mr. Franks's outfit, but, as explained in a previous chapter, I hired out Mr. Ellis until I could enlist in Captain Roberts's company. About the middle of May, 1875, Joe Franks had worked back over into Menard County. I wished to see my old friends in his outfit, and so went over to meet them. While there, I mentioned that I was going to join the Rangers. A cowboy named Norman Rogers, who was working for Mr. Franks, said he would also like to join, so we decided we would go over to Captain Roberts together and see if we couldn't get him to recruit us into his company. Rogers and I rode over to the Ranger camp beyond Maynardville. Neither of us had ever been in such a camp before, nor did we know anyone in the company. Of the first ranger we met, we inquired where we could find the captain. His tent was pointed out to us, and we went toward it. "Jim," said Norman as we approached the tent, "you will have to do the talking." Captain Roberts met us as we came up and invited us to be seated. I told him at once that we had come to enlist as rangers. He asked us our names, where we were working, and finally inquired if we had anyone that would recommend us. We had not thought of references, but told him that probably Mr. Franks or Mr. Ellis would stand for us, as they were well-known and prominent cattlemen for whom we had worked. Captain Roberts looked straight at me and said, "Did you say your name was Gillett?" "Yes, Jim Gillett," I replied. He then asked me where I was born, and I told him in Austin, Texas. "Are you a son of James S. Gillett, who was Adjutant General under Governor Sam Houston?" I told him I was. "I have often heard my father, Buck Roberts, speak of your father," he said in a friendly tone. Captain Roberts then asked us what kind of horses we had, telling us that a ranger was required to have a good amount, for each man was allowed to have only one horse, which had to be a good one, that could be ridden every day for a month, if necessary. I told the captain I had 2 good pony mares. He burst out laughing, and said a mare was not allowed in the service. He then told us to go and see what kind of amount we could get, come back, and let him inspect the animals. The captain never once said he would enlist us, but as the interview was now over, and he had not refused us, we went back to camp feeling very hopeful we would soon be rangers. I secured a big black pony, and Norman a gray one, not so large as mine, but a much prettier horse. We returned to the ranger camp a few days later, mounted on these ponies. The captain looked them over, said they were rather small, but that he would accept them, and told us to be at his camp by May 31st to be sworn into the service. We left camp that evening all puffed up at the prospect of being Texas Rangers. The last day of May arrived. Norman Rogers and myself, with many other recruits we had never seen before, were at the ranger camp. On June 1st, 1875, at 10 o'clock, we were formed in line, mounted, and the oath of allegiance to the state of Texas was read to us by Captain Roberts. When we had all signed this oath, we were pronounced Texas Rangers. This was probably the happiest day of my life, for I had realized one of my greatest ambitions and was now a member of the most famous and efficient body of mounted police in the world. Immediately upon being sworn in, the men were divided into messes, 10 men to the mess, and issued 10 days' rations by the orderly sergeant. These rations consisted of flour, bacon, coffee, sugar, beans, rice, pepper, salt, and soda. No potatoes, syrup, or lard was furnished, and each man had to supply his own cooking utensils. To shorten our bread, we used bacon grease. Beef was sometimes supplied by the men, but wild game was so plentiful that little other meat was required. Furthermore, each recruit was furnished with a Sharps carbine, .50 caliber, and .145 Colt's pistol. These arms were charged to each ranger, their cost to be deducted from our first pay. Our salary of $40 per month was paid in quarterly installments. The state also supplied provender for the horses. Though a ranger was forced to supply his own mount, the state undertook to pay for the animal if it were killed or lost in an Indian fight. To establish the impartial value of our animals, Captain Roberts marched us into Maynardville and asked 3 citizens of the town to place a value on each man's mount. This was done, and I was highly gratified when Old Coley, my mount, was appraised at $125. This formality was over, the company was moved from Little Saline to Camp Los Morris, 5 miles southwest of Maynardville, Texas. We were now ready to begin scouting for Indians. As is usual under the same circumstances, the new recruits came in for their share of pranks and mishaps. One raw rookie in my mess, fired with love of economy, undertook to cook 10 days' rations for the whole mess at one time. He put a quantity of rice on the fire. Soon it began to boil and swell, and that surprised ranger found his rice increasing in unheard-of proportions. He filled every cooking vessel in the mess with half-cooked rice, and still the kettle continued to overflow. In desperation, he finally began to pour it on the ground. Even then, he had enough rice cooked to supply the entire company. Another recruit, anxious to test his new weapons, obtained Captain Roberts's permission to go hunting. He had not gone far from camp before he began firing at some squirrels. One of his bullets struck the limb of a tree and whizzed close to camp. This gave an old ranger an idea. He hastened after the hunter and gravely arrested him, declaring that the glancing bullet had struck a man in camp and that Captain Roberts had ordered the careless hunter's arrest. The veteran brought in a pale and badly scared recruit. One of the favorite diversions of the old rangers was to make a newcomer believe that the state furnished the rangers with socks and start him off to the captain's tent to demand his share of free hosiery. The captain took these pranks in good part and assured the crestfallen applicant that the rangers were only playing a joke on him, while his tormentors enjoyed his discomfiture from a safe distance. When they had run out of jokes, the rangers settled down to the regular routine of camp. Each morning the orderly sergeant had roll call, at which time he always detailed 6 or 8 men with a non-commissioned officer to take charge of the rangers' horses and the pack mules until relieved the following morning by a new guard. The guard was mounted and armed and drove the loose stock out to graze. The horses were never taken far from camp for fear of being attacked by Indians, and also to keep them near at hand in case they were needed quickly. The rangers not on guard spent their time as they wished, when not on duty, but no man could leave the camp without the captain's permission. The boys played such games as appealed to them, horseshoe pitching and cards being the favorite diversions. As long as it did not interfere with a man's duty as a ranger, Captain Roberts permitted pony racing, and some exciting contests took place between rival horse owners. And hunting and fishing were always available, for woods and streams were stocked with game and fish. I soon had cause to congratulate myself on my enlistment in Company D, for I found Captain D.W. Roberts the best of company commanders. At the time I joined his command, he was just 35 years of age, very slender, and perhaps a little over 6 feet tall. His beard and hair were dark auburn. He was always neatly dressed and was kind and affable in manner, looking more like the dean of an Eastern college than the great captain he was. Captain Roberts was a fine horseman and a good shot with both pistol and rifle. He was also a fine violinist and often played for the boys. He had been raised on the frontier and had such a great reputation as an Indian fighter that the 14th Legislature of Texas presented him with a fine Winchester rifle for his gallantry in fighting the Native Americans. The captain had made a close study of the habits and actions of the Indians and had become such an authority that their life was an open book to him. This, of course, gave him a great advantage in following and fighting them, and under his able leadership, Company D became famous. There was not a man in the company that did not consider it a compliment to be detailed on a scout with Captain Roberts. In the latter part of the summer or early fall of 1875, Captain Roberts visited Colorado County, Texas, and returned with a bride, Miss Lou Conway. Mrs. Roberts was a very refined and elegant lady, and soon adapted herself to the customs of the camp. She was with her husband on the San Saba River during the winter of 1875 to 76, and soon became as popular with the company as Captain Roberts himself. Most people consider the life of the Texas Ranger hard and dangerous, but I never found it so. In the first place, the Ranger was always with a body of well-armed men, more than a match for any enemy that might be met. Then there was an element of danger about it that appealed to any red-blooded American. All of western Texas was a real frontier then, and for one who loved nature and God's own creation, it was a paradise on earth. The hills and valleys were teeming with deer and turkey, thousands of buffalo and antelope were on the plains, and the streams all over Texas were full of fish. Bee caves and bee trees abounded. In the springtime one could travel for hundreds of miles on a bed of flowers. Oh, how I wish I had the power to describe the wonderful country as I saw it then. How happy I am now in my old age that I am a native Texan and saw the grand frontier before it was marred by the hand of man. The Lipans, Kickapoos, Comanches, and Kiowa Indians used to time their raids so as to reach the Texas settlements during the light of the moon, so they would have moonlight nights in which to steal horses and make their getaway before they could be discovered. By morning, when their thefts became known, they would have a long lead ahead and be well out on their way into the plains and mountains. The captains of the ranger companies knew of this Indian habit and accordingly kept scouts constantly in the field during the period of the raids. The Native Americans coming in from the plains where water was scarce generally took the near cut to the headwaters of the Colorado, Concho, San Saba, Llanos, Guadalupe, and Nueces rivers. By maintaining scouts at or near the heads of these streams, the rangers frequently caught parties of Indians going in or coming out from the settlements and destroyed them or recaptured the stolen stock. The first light moon in June, Captain Roberts ordered a detachment of 15 men in command of Sergeant James B. Hawkins to make a 10-day scout toward the headwaters of the North Llano River. He was to select a secluded spot near old abandoned Fort Tarrant and make camp there. Each morning, a scout of 1 or 2 men would be sent out 10 or 15 miles south, and another party a like distance toward the north to hunt for Indian trails. The main body of rangers, keeping carefully concealed, was in readiness to take up an Indian trail at a moment's notice should one be found by the scouts. One morning, Sergeant Hawkins ordered me to travel south from camp to the head draws of the South Llano and watch for pony tracks. "Suppose the Indians get me?" I asked laughingly as I mounted my pony. "It's your business to keep a sharp lookout and not let them catch you," he replied. However, though I watched very carefully, I could find no pony tracks or Indian trails. We had with us on this scout Mike Lynch, a pure Irishman. Though he was old and gray-headed, he was a good ranger and had much native wit. One morning it was Uncle Mike's turn to go on scout duty, but in a few hours he was seen coming into camp with his horse, Possum, on the jump. He reported a fresh Indian trail about 10 miles north of our camp. When asked how many pony tracks he had counted, Lynch at once declared he had counted 17 and thought there were more. As the Indians usually came in on foot or with as few ponies as they could get by on until they could steal others, Sergeant Hawkins suspected the tracks Lynch had seen were those of mustangs. The excited scout declared vehemently that the tracks were not those of wild horses, but of Indians. The sergeant was just as positive that no Indian party was responsible for the trail, and the two had quite a heated argument over the tracks. "But how do you know it is an Indian trail?" demanded Hawkins. "Because I know," cried out Lynch in a loud voice. That settled it. Horses were saddled and mules packed as quickly as possible, and the Rangers marched over to the suspicious trail. When Sergeant Hawkins examined the trail, he soon discovered that the sign had been made by mustangs, but could not convince the hard-headed Irishman until he followed the trail 2 or 3 miles and showed him the mustang herd quietly grazing under some shade trees. Uncle Mike did not mention Indian Trail any more on that scout. Though we did not find any trails or Indians, the scouting party killed 2 black bears, several deer, and about 15 wild turkeys. Early in September 1875, Captain Roberts again ordered Sergeant Hawkins to take 15 men and make a 10 days' scout on the Brady Mountains. To my great joy, I was detailed on this expedition. When near the head of Scalp Creek, Menard County, on our return trip, the sergeant told the boys to keep a sharp lookout for deer, as we would reach San Saba by noon and would camp on that stream for the night. We had not traveled far before Ed Seeker killed a nice little spiked buck. We strapped him on one of the pack mules, and when we arrived at the river, we came upon a flock of half-grown wild turkeys. Bill Clements leapt from his horse and killed 6 of them. We then camped, hobbled, and sidelined our horses and put a strong guard with them. While some of the boys were gathering wood for our fire, they found an old elm stump 10 to 12 feet high, with bees going in at the top. One of the Rangers rode over to Roof Wind's ranch and borrowed an axe and a bucket. When he returned, we cut the tree and got more honey than 16 men could eat, besides filling the bucket with nice sealed honey which we gave to Mrs. Wynne in return for the use of her axe. Then, after dinner, out came fishing tackle, and, using venison for bait, we caught more catfish than the entire crowd could eat. Hunting conditions in those days were ideal. I have known a single scout to kill 3 or 4 bears on a single trip. The companies to the north of us were never out of buffalo meat in season. Then, in the fall, one could gather enough pecans, as fine as ever grew, in half a day to last the company a month. I have seen hundreds of bushels of the nuts go to waste because there was no one to gather them. Besides, they sold on the market for 50 cents per bushel. No wonder that a boy that loved the woods and nature was charmed and fascinated with the life of the Texas Ranger. It was a picnic for me from start to finish, and the 6 years I was with the battalion were the happiest and most interesting of my life. But hunting and fishing and vacation scouts were not the sole duties of a ranger. Pleasure was abundant, but there were times when all these were laid aside. For the game guns and the fishing rod, we exchanged our carbines and our 6-shooters and engaged in hazardous expeditions after marauding Native Americans. I was soon to see this latter aspect of Ranger life, for in the latter part of August, 1875, I became a real Ranger and entered upon the real work of our battalion, that of protecting the frontier against the roving Indians and engaging them in regular pitched battles. Chapter 4. My first brush with Indians. Table of contents. The latter part of August, 1875, Private L.P. Seeker was sent on detached service to Fort Mason, about 50 miles due east of our camp. While there, a runner came in from Honey Creek with the report that a band of 15 Indians had raided the John Gamble Ranch and stolen some horses within 25 steps of the ranch house. The Native Americans appeared on their raid late in the evening, and the runner reached Mason just at dark. Lamb Seeker had just eaten his supper and was sitting in the lobby of the Frontier Hotel when the message came. He hurried to the livery stable, saddled his horse, Old Pete, and started on an all-night ride for the company. The nights in August are short, but Seeker rode into our camp about 8 o'clock the following morning and reported the presence of the Indians. The company horses were out under herd for the day, but Captain Roberts sent out hurry orders for them. Sergeant Plunk Murray was ordered to detail 15 men, issue them 10 days' rations, and 100 rounds of ammunition each. Second Sergeant Jim Hawkins, Privates Paul Durham, Nick Donnelly, Tom Gillespie, Mike Lynch, Andy Wilson, Henry Maltimore, Jim Trout, William Kimbrough, Silas B. Crump, Ed Seeker, Jim Day, John Cupps, and myself, under command of Captain Roberts, were selected as the personnel of the Scout. As can be imagined, I was delighted with my good fortune in getting on the party and looked forward with intense satisfaction to my first brush with Indians. The mules were soon packed, and by the time the horses reached camp, the Scout was ready. Sergeant Hawkins, as soon as the men had saddled their horses, walked over to the captain, saluted, and told him the Scout was ready. Before leaving camp, Captain Roberts called to Sergeant Murray and told him that he believed the Indians had about as many horses as they could well get away with, and that they would probably cross the San Saba River near the mouth of Scalp Creek and follow the high divide between the two streams on their westward march back into the plains. If the Native Americans did not travel that way, the captain thought they would go out up the Big Saline, follow the divide between the North Llano and San Saba rivers westward, and escape, but he was confident the band would travel up the divide north of Maynardville. He determined to scout that way himself and instructed Murray to send 2 rangers south over to the headwaters of Bear Creek to keep a sharp lookout for the trail. These 2 scouts were to repeat their operations the next day, and if they discovered the Indian trail, Murray was to make up a second scout and follow the Native Americans vigorously. His plan outlined, Captain Roberts gave the order to mount, and we rode toward Menardville, making inquiry about the Indians. All was quiet at this little frontier village, so we crossed the San Saba River just below the town, and after passing the ruins of the Spanish fort, Captain Roberts halted his men and prepared to send out trailers. 2 of the best trailers in the command were ordered to proceed about 400 yards ahead of the party and keep a close watch for pony tracks while they traveled due north at a good saddle horse gait. The main body of men, under the captain himself, would follow directly behind the outposts. Our party had traveled about 8 or 9 miles when Captain Roberts's keen eyes discovered a lone pony standing with his head down straight ahead of us. He sighted the animal before the trailers did and remarked to us that there the trail was. The outposts halted when they saw the pony and waited for us to come up. Sure enough, here was the Indian trail probably 20 yards wide. Captain Roberts dismounted and walked over the sign, scrutinizing every pony track, bunch of grass, and fallen leaf. He then examined the old pony. The animal was cut with a lance, with his back sore and his feet all worn out. It was then between 12 and 1 o'clock, and the captain thought the Indians had passed that way about sunrise, for the blood and sweat on the horse was now dry. The trial showed the raiders were driving rather fast and were probably 35 or 40 miles ahead of us. The captain decided it would be a long chase and that we would just have to walk them down if we caught them at all. There was no water on this divide, so we took the trail without stopping for dinner. Captain Roberts had a fine saddle horse, Old Rock, and we followed the trail at a steady gait of 5 or 6 miles an hour. At sundown, we reached the old government road that runs from Fort McCavitt to Fort Concho. We were then about 12 or 15 miles south of Kickapoo Springs, so we turned up the road, reaching the springs late at night. The horses had not had a drop of water since leaving the San Saba that morning, and facing a hot August sun all day, the men were pretty well tired out when they reached camp, had supper, and got to bed. We estimated we had ridden about 60 miles since leaving camp. During the day, Captain Roberts's horse cast a shoe, so Tom Gillespie shot him by firelight, as it was the captain's intention to resume the trail at daylight. The following morning, Captain Roberts took a southwest course from Kickapoo Springs and paralleled the Indian trail we had left the evening before. It was late in the day before we picked the trail up again, and many of the boys were afraid we had lost it altogether. But the captain laughed at their fears and never doubted that we should find it again. The Indians, as their trial showed, were now traveling over a tolerably rough country, which made our progress slow. About noon, we found some rainwater, and as it was fearfully hot, we camped for dinner and to give the horses a short rest. When the boys went out to catch their mounts, we found that we had camped right in a bed of rattlesnakes. 2 of our horses had been bitten. Jim Day's Checo had a head on him as big as a barrel, while the captain's horse, Old Rock, had been bitten on his front leg just above the ankle, and it had swollen up to his body. Neither of the animals was able to walk. Jim Day could not be left alone in that Indian country, so Captain Roberts detailed private cups to stay with Day until the horses died or were able to travel. In either case, they were then to return to camp. The animals soon recovered, and Day and Cups beat us back to camp. The pack loads were now doubled on one mule, so Captain Roberts could ride the other. Reduced to 13 men, we followed the Indians until night. It was a hard day for both men and beasts, so we camped where we found a little water, in a draw that drained into the South Concho River. Considering the way we had come, the captain thought we had covered 60 miles during the day's ride. We had 2 rather old men on the scout, Mike Lynch and Andy Wilson, and they were nearly all in. I awoke Andy at 2 a.m. to go on guard. The poor fellow was so stiff he could hardly stand, and I tried to get him to go back to bed, telling him I would stand his guard, but he was game, and in a few minutes hobbled out to the horses and relieved me. Early in the morning we were up and traveling. The mule Captain Roberts was riding did not step out as fast as Old Rock had done, and the boys had an easier time keeping up. We camped at noon with just enough rainwater to do us and took up the trail again after dinner. The trailers stopped suddenly, and as we rode up, Captain Roberts asked what was the matter. They said it seemed as though the Indians at this point had rounded up the horses and held them for some cause or other. The captain dismounted and swept the country with his field glasses. He circled around where the horses had been standing and found where a lone Indian had walked straight away from the animals. He followed the tracks to an old live oak tree that had been blown down. Then the reason for the stop became apparent. The Indians had sighted a herd of mustangs grazing just beyond this tree, and the Native American had slipped up on them and killed a big brown mare. Captain Roberts picked up the cartridge shell the old brave had used and found it to be from a .50 caliber buffalo gun. We also found the mustang, from which the Indians had cut both sides of ribs and one hind quarter. Captain Roberts was much elated. "Boys," he said with a smile, "we now have 95 chances out of 100 to catch those Indians. They will not carry this raw meat long before stopping to cook some. We have followed them now over 150 miles, and they have never stopped to build a fire. They are tired and hungry, and probably know where there is water not far away." He spoke with such confidence that I marveled at his knowledge of Indian habits. We were now on the extreme western draw of the South Concho River, far above the point at which the water breaks out into a running stream. Finally, the trail led out on that level, and a vast tract of country between the head of South Concho and the Pecos on the west. These Indians turned a little north from the general direction they had been traveling, and all of a sudden we came to some rock-water holes. Here the Native Americans had built 3 fires, cooked both sides of the mustang ribs, and had picked them clean. From this high tableland they could look back over their trail for 15 miles. The captain thought they had been there early in the morning, as the fires were out and the ashes cold. We did not lose any time at this camp, but hurried on, following the trail until late in the evening, when the trailers again halted. When we came up, we found that the trail that had been going west for nearly 200 miles had suddenly turned straight north. Captain Roberts seemed to be puzzled for a time and said he did not understand this move. About 1 mile north there was a small motte of mesquite timber. This he examined through his glasses, seeming to me to examine each tree separately. The trail led straight into these trees, and we followed it. In the mesquite timber we found the Indians had hacked some bushes partly down, bent them over, cut up the horse meat they had been carrying with them into tiny strips, strung it on the bushes, and building a fire beneath them, had barbecued their flesh. The Native Americans had made the prettiest scaffalo for meat cooking I ever saw. We found plenty of fire here, and the captain was sure we would have an Indian fight on the morrow. From the trees, the trail swung west again. The Native Americans were traveling slowly now, as they evidently thought they were out of danger. Just before sundown, the scout halted, and we were ordered not to let any smoke go up lest the band we were trailing should spot it and take alarm. As soon as we had cooked our supper, Captain Roberts had the fires carefully extinguished. It had been a good season on the tablelands, and there were many ponds filled with water, some of them 100 yards wide. We camped right on the edge of one of these big holes, and where the Indians had waded into it, the water was still muddy. The boys were cautioned not to strike a match that night, as we were certain the Indians were not far ahead of us. We covered between 40 and 50 miles that day. Camp was called at daybreak. We dared not build a fire, so we could have no breakfast. We saddled our horses and again took the trail. Old Jenny, the pack mule, was packed for the last time on earth, for she was killed in the fight that shortly followed. As soon as it was light enough to see a pony track, two of the boys traced it on foot and led their horses, the remainder of our party coming along slowly on horseback. By sunrise we were all riding and following the trail rapidly, eager to sight the marauding thieves. We had traveled some 5 or 6 miles when Paul Durham called Captain Roberts's attention to a dark object ahead that looked as if it were moving. The captain brought his field glasses to bear on the object specified, and exclaimed it was the Indians. He ordered the boys to dismount at once, tighten their cinches, leave their coats and slickers, and prepare to fight. As we carried out this order, a distressing stillness came over the men. Captain Roberts and Sergeant Hawkins were the only ones of our party that had ever been in an Indian fight, and I suppose the hearts of all of us green, unseasoned warriors beat a little more rapidly than usual at the prospect of soon smelling powder. Captain Roberts called out to us in positive tones not to leave him until he told us to go, and not to draw a gun or pistol until ordered, declaring that he wanted no mistake on the eve of battle. He ordered the pack mule caught and led until we went into the fight, when she was to be turned loose. The Indians were out on an open prairie dotted here and there with small skirts of mesquite timber. The captain thought our only chance was to ride double file straight at them, in the hope they would not look back and discover us. We moved forward briskly, and as luck would have it, we got within 400 or 500 yards of the Native Americans before they sighted us. At once there was a terrible commotion. The Indians rounded up their stock and caught fresh mounts almost in the twinkling of an eye. Then, led by their old chief, they took positions on a little elevated ground some 200 yards beyond the loose horses. The Native Americans stationed themselves about 15 or 20 feet apart, their battle line when formed being about 100 yards wide. As each warrior took his station, he dismounted, stood behind his horse, and prepared to fire when given the signal. The captain, with a smile, turned to us and said, "Boys, they are going to fight us. See how beautifully the old chief forms his line of battle." From a little boy I had longed to be a ranger and fight the Indians. At last, I was up against the real thing, and with not so much as an umbrella behind which to hide. I was nervous. I was awfully nervous. We were now within 100 steps of the Native Americans. Then came the order to dismount, shoot low, and kill as many horses as possible. The captain said as we came up that every time we got an Indian on foot in that country, we were sure to kill him. With the first shot, everybody, Indian and ranger, began firing and yelling. In a minute, we had killed 2 horses, and 1 Indian was seen to be badly wounded. In another minute, the Native Americans had mounted their horses and were fleeing in every direction. Captain Roberts now ordered us to mount and follow them. The roar of the guns greatly excited my pony, and he turned round and round. I lost a little time in mounting, but when I did get settled in the saddle, I saw an Indian running on foot. He carried a Winchester in his hand and waved to another Indian who was riding. The latter turned and took the one on foot up behind him. As they started away for a race, I thought to myself that no grass pony on earth could carry two men and get away from me and old Coley. The Indians had a good animal, but I gradually closed on them. The Native American riding behind would point his gun back and fire at me, holding it in one hand. I retaliated by firing at him every time I could get a cartridge in my old Sharps carbine. I looked back and saw Ed Seeker coming to my aid as fast as old Dixie would run. He waved encouragement to me. Finally, the old brave ceased shooting, and as I drew a little closer, he held out his gun at arm's length and let it drop, probably thinking I would stop to get it. I just gave it a passing glance as I galloped by. He then held out what looked to be a fine rawhide rope and dropped that, but I never took the bait. I just kept closing in on him. He now strung his bow and began using his arrows pretty freely. Finally, he saw I was going to catch him and turned quickly into a little grove of mesquite timber. I was considered a fairly good brush rider, and as we went in among the trees, I drew right up within 20 steps of the brave, jumped from my mount, and made a sort of random shot at the horse, Indian and all. The big .50 caliber bullet struck the Indian pony just where its head couples on its neck, passed through the head, and came out over the left eye. It killed the horse at once, and it fell forward 20 feet. The old warrior hit the ground running, but I jumped my horse and ran after him. As I passed the dead horse, I saw the front rider struggling to get from under it. To my surprise, I saw he was a white boy between 15 and 16 years old, with long, bright red hair. By this time, Ed Seeker had arrived and was dismounting. The fugitive warrior now peeped from behind a tree, and I got a fine shot at his face, but overshot him 6 inches, cutting off a limb just over his head. He broke to run again, and as he came into view, Ed placed a bullet between his shoulders. He was dead in a minute. As Ed and I walked up to the dead Indian, we found he had also been shot in one ankle, and his bow had been partly shot in two. In his quiver, he had left only 3 arrows. Seeker and I hurried back to the dead horse to help the white boy, but he had extricated himself and disappeared. We then returned to the dead warrior, and Seeker scalped him. We took the Indian's bow shield and a fine pair of moccasins. I also found a fine lance near where the horse fell, and I presume it was carried by the white boy. We found the Native American had no Winchester cartridges, and this was why he dropped the gun. He could not carry it and use his bow. We went back over the trail, but were unable to find the gun the brave had dropped as a bait. By noon that day, the boys had all returned to where the fight had begun, and the Indian horses had been left. Jim Hawkins and Paul Durham captured a Mexican boy about 15 years old. He looked just like an Indian, had long plaited hair down his back, was bareheaded, wore moccasins and a breechclout. Had he been in front of me, I would surely have killed him for a Native American. Captain Roberts spoke Spanish fluently, and from this boy he learned that the Indians were Lipans that lived in Old Mexico. He was taken back to our camp, and finally his uncle came and took him home. He had been captured while herding oxen near old Fort Clark, Texas, and an elder brother, who was with him at the time, had been killed. The boys were then sent back by Captain Roberts to find the white lad that had been with the Indian Seeker had been killed. Though we searched carefully, we could find no trace of the mysterious youngster. Some years later, I learned that this boy's name was Fisher, and that his parents went into Old Mexico and ransomed him. He was from Llano County, and after his return he wrote, or had written, a small pamphlet that contained an account of his life with the Indians. He told of being with old Chief Magoosh in this fight. He declared he hid in the grass, within sight of the Rangers while they were hunting him, but was afraid to show himself for fear of being killed. When the Rangers had all gathered after the fight, our pack mule, Jenny, was missing. We supposed in the run that she had followed the Indians off. 6 months later, Ed Seeker was detailed to pilot a body of United States soldiers over that same country to pick out a road to the Pecos River. He visited our old battlefield and found Jenny's carcass. She had a bullet hole in the center of her forehead. The Indians, in shooting back at their attackers, probably hit her with a chance shot. The pack saddle was still strapped to her body, but wolves had eaten all the supplies. 500 rounds of ammunition were still with her, showing that no one had seen her since the day of her death. Lacking Jenny's supplies, we did not have a blooming thing to eat but the barbecued horse meat we had captured from the Indians. This had no salt on it, and I just could not swallow it. In the fight, we killed 3 horses and 1 Indian and captured the Mexican lad. At least 2 Native Americans were badly wounded, and as victors we captured 58 heads of horses and mules, several Indian saddles and bridles, and many native trinkets. Not a man or a horse of our party was hurt, the pack mule being our only fatality. All voted Captain Roberts the best man in the world. We turned our faces homeward, hungry and tired, but highly elated over our success. The second day after the fight, we reached Wash DeLong's ranch on the headwaters of the South Concho River. Mr. DeLong, a fine frontiersman, killed beef for us and furnished us with flour and coffee without cost. 3 days later, we were back at our camp at Los Morris. The stolen stock was returned to their owners, and thus ended my first campaign against the Indians. Chapter 5. The Mason County War. Table of Contents. Soon after our return from our first brush with Indians, we were introduced to yet another phase of ranger activity, the quieting of feuds, for not only were the rangers employed in protecting the frontiers against the Indians, but they were also frequently called upon to preserve law and order within the towns and cities of the state. In those early days, men's passions were high and easily aroused. In a country where all men went armed, recourse to firearms was frequent, and these feuds sometimes led to active warfare between the adherents of each party, to the great discomfort of the citizens among whom such a miniature war was staged. Mason and the adjoining county, Gillespie, had been settled by Germans in the early history of the state. These settlers were quiet, peaceful, and made most excellent citizens, loyal to their adopted country and government when undisturbed. Most of these Germans engaged in stock raising and were sorely tried by the rustlers and Indians that committed many depredations upon their cattle. In the latter part of September 1875, Tim Williamson, a prominent cattleman living in Mason County, was arrested on a charge of cattle theft by John Worley, a deputy sheriff of that county. Previous to that time, there had been a number of complaints about loss of cattle, and the Germans charged that many of their cattle had been stolen and the brands burned. Much indignation had been aroused among the stockmen of the county, and threats of violence against the thieves were common. As soon as the news of Williamson's arrest on charge of cattle thieving became known, a large mob formed and set out in pursuit of the deputy sheriff and his prisoner. On his way to Mason, Worley was overtaken by this posse. When he saw the pursuing men, Williamson divined their purpose and begged the sheriff to let him run in an effort to save his life. Worley refused and, it is said, drew his pistol and deliberately shot Williamson's horse through the loin, causing it to fall. Unarmed and unmounted, Williamson was killed without a chance to protect himself and without any pretense of a trial. After the murder, Worley and the mob disappeared. Whether or not Williamson was guilty of the charge against him, he had friends who bitterly resented the deputy sheriff's refusal to allow the murdered man a chance for his life, and his death caused a great deal of excitement and bitter comment in the county. A man named Scott Cooley, an ex-ranger of Captain Perry's Company D, was a particular friend of Williamson and his family. Cooley had quit the ranger service at the time of his friend's murder and was cultivating a farm near Maynardville. He had worked for the dead man and had made 2 trips up the trail with him. While working with the murdered cattleman, Cooley had contracted a bad case of typhoid fever and had been nursed back to health by Mrs. Williamson's own hands. When the news of Tim Williamson's murder reached Scott Cooley, he was much incensed and vowed vengeance against the murderers of his friend. He left his farm at once and, saddling his pony, rode into the town of Mason heavily armed. He had worked out a careful plan of his own and proceeded to put it into execution immediately on his arrival. Stabling his horse in a livery stable, he registered at the hotel. As he was entirely unknown in Mason, Cooley remained in town several days without creating any suspicion. He proved himself a good detective and soon discovered that the sheriff and his deputy were the leaders in the mob that had killed his friend. Biding his time and pursuing his investigations, he soon learned the names of every man in the posse that murdered Williamson. His information complete, Cooley decided upon action. He mounted his pony and rode out to the home of John Worley, the deputy sheriff who had refused Williamson a chance to flee for his life. Cooley found Worley engaged in cleaning out a well. The avenger dismounted, asked for a drink of water, and entered into conversation with the unsuspecting man. Finally, as Worley was drawing his assistant out of the well, Cooley asked him if his name was John Worley. The deputy sheriff replied that it was. Cooley then declared his mission and shot the sheriff to death. At the first crack of Cooley's pistol, Worley let the windlass go, and the man he was drawing up out of the well fell back about 25 feet into it. Cooley deliberately stooped down, cut off both of Worley's ears, put them in his pocket, and galloped off. Victim number 1 was chalked up to Williamson's credit. Making a quick ride across Mason County to the western edge of Llano County, Cooley waylaid and killed Pete Brader, the second on his list of mob members. These two murders struck terror into the hearts of nearly every citizen of Mason County. No one could tell who would be the next victim of the unerring aim of Scott Cooley's rifle. The whole county rose up in arms to protect themselves. Terrified lest he be the next victim of the avenger, Cooley, the sheriff of Mason County, promptly left Mason and never returned. Tim Williamson had other friends anxious to avenge him, and the killing of Brader was their rallying signal. John and Mose Beard, George Gladden, and John Ringgold immediately joined Cooley in his work of vengeance. The gang rode into the town of Mason, and in a fight with a posse of citizens, killed another man. Fearing the outbreak of a real feud war in Mason, the governor of Texas ordered Major Jones to the relief of the frightened citizens. The order reached Major Jones while he was on his way down the line near the head of the Guadalupe River. He at once turned his company back, and with a detachment of 10 men from Company D, he marched to Mason. Company A, Major Jones's escort, was then commanded by Captain Ira Long, and the 30 men in that company and the 10 boys of Company D gave the Major 40 men for his relief expedition. Before the Rangers could reach Mason, the sheriff's party had a fight with Cooley's gang down on the Llano River and killed Mose Beard. On his arrival in Mason, Major Jones sent scouts in every direction to hunt Cooley. He kept this up for nearly 2 weeks, but without result. He finally learned that nearly the whole of his command, especially the Company D boys that had ranged with Cooley, was in sympathy with the outlaw and was making no serious attempt to locate or imperil him. It was even charged that some of the Company D Rangers met Cooley at night on the outskirts of Mason and told him they did not care if he killed every D to Dutchman in Mason County that formed part of the mob that had murdered Williamson. Major Jones saw he would have to take drastic steps at once. He drew up his whole force of 40 men and made them an eloquent speech. He said he had a special pride in the Frontier Battalion and was making it his life study, and that he personally had a kindly feeling for every man in the service. He then reminded the men in the most touching manner of the oath they had taken to protect the state of Texas against all her enemies whatsoever, an oath every true man was bound to honor. He declared he knew many of the command had a friendly feeling for Scott Cooley, especially those boys who had shared the life of a ranger with him, and that he, himself, felt keenly the position in which they were placed. While Tim Williamson had met a horrible death at the hands of a relentless mob, that did not justify Cooley in killing people in a private war of vengeance in defiance of the law and the Rangers. At the climax of his speech, the Major said, "Men, I now have a proposition to make to you. If every man here who is in sympathy with Scott Cooley and his gang, and who does not wish to pursue him to the bitter end, will step out of ranks, I will issue him an honorable discharge and let him quit the service clean." The Major paused, and about 15 men stepped to the front. "Gentlemen," continued Major Jones, "those who do not avail themselves of this opportunity, I shall expect to use all diligence and strength in helping me to break up or capture these violators of the law." After the discharge of the Cooley sympathizers, the Rangers went to work with a new vigor, and finally captured George Gladden and John Ringgold. Gladden was sent to the state penitentiary for 25 years, while Ringgold received a life sentence. Probably Scott Cooley was informed of Major Jones's appeal to the Rangers, for he became less active around Mason after this. John Beard, it was reported, skipped Texas and went to Arizona. Soon after Cooley killed John Worley, Norman Rogers got permission from Captain Roberts to ride over to Joe Frank's cow outfit to exchange his horse for a better one. When Rogers rode into the cowboy camp, he noticed a man resting under a tree near the fire. The stranger called one of the cowboys and asked him who Norman was. As Rogers left camp, this man followed him and asked if he were one of Roberts's Rangers and if he knew Major Reynolds. Rogers replied that he knew Reynolds very well. The man then declared he was Scott Cooley, and reaching into his pocket, he pulled out John Worley's ears. "You take these ears to Major Reynolds with my compliments, but don't you tell anybody you saw me." Rogers duly delivered the ears, and Reynolds cautioned him to say nothing about them. 40 years afterward, at an old settlers' reunion in Sweetwater, Norman Rogers mentioned this incident in a speech. He had kept his promise to Cooley and Reynolds all those years. Having lost his friends and his sympathizers in the Rangers, Cooley returned to Blanco County, where he had formerly lived. Here he was stricken with brain fever, and though tenderly nursed, shielded by his friends, he died without ever being brought to trial for his killings. This ended the Mason County War, but before the feud died, some 10 or 12 men were killed, and a race war narrowly averted. Chapter 6. Major Jones and his escort. Table of Contents. Despite their usefulness in protecting the frontiers and in maintaining law and order, the Texas Rangers have always had to fight more or less strenuously to obtain the necessary appropriation for their annual maintenance from the state legislature. Whenever the appropriation is small, there is but one remedy: reduce the personnel of each company to the lowest limits possible. In the fall of 1875, the Adjutant General notified the captains all along the line to reduce their companies to 20 men each for the winter at the end of the current quarter. As the day for reduction arrived, there were some anxious moments among the men of Company D, as no one knew just who was to be retained in the service. On December 1st, Captain Roberts formed the command in line and explained it was his sad duty to reduce the company to 20 men, and announced that the orderly sergeant would read the names of those to be retained in the company. The sergeant then stepped forward and began to read. First Sergeant Plunk Murray, Second Sergeant James Hawkins, First Corporal Lamb Seeker, Second Corporal Tom Griffin, and Privates Charles Neville, Tom Gillespie, Nick Donnelly, Jim Trout, Henry Maltimore, Kit Maltimore, Jack Martin, W.T. Clements, Ed Seeker, Andy Wilson, J.W. Bell, Norman Rogers, Doc Long, Tom Meade, Frank Hill, and Jim Gillett were the lucky ones to be retained in the command. The remainder of the company was thereupon discharged. My relief may be imagined when my name was read out, for I had learned to love the Ranger life and was loth to quit it. After reduction, we went into winter camp in a bend of the San Saba River about 3 miles east of Menardville. In the river bottom was plenty of good timber, so each mess of 5 men built a log cabin, 16 to 18 feet square, for their occupancy. These cabins, each with a chimney and a fireplace, formed the western side of our horse corral and made most comfortable winter abodes. During the winter, the boys played many tricks upon each other, for there were no Indian raids during the time we were in this winter camp. One of the favorite stunts was to extract the bullet from a cartridge, take out the powder, and wrap it in a rag, and then, while the inmates of a given cabin would be quietly smoking or reading or talking around their fire, climb upon the roof and drop the rag down the chimney. When the powder exploded in the fire, the surprised Rangers would fall backward off their benches, to the huge glee of the prank player. At other times, a couple of Rangers would post themselves outside a neighbor's cabin and begin to yell, "Fire! Fire!" at the top of their lungs. If the cabin owners did not stand in the doorway to protect it all, the Rangers in camp would rush up and throw bedding, cooking utensils, saddles and bridles, guns and pistols outside as quickly as they could. In a jiffy, the cabin would be cleaned out, and the victims of the joke would have to lug all their belongings back in again. But not all our time was spent on practical jokes. There were many rangers of a studious mind, and during the long winter evenings they pored over their books. Several of our boys, by their study here and at other leisure hours, qualified themselves for doctors, lawyers, and professional callings. And there were several writers in camp that contributed more or less regularly to the magazines and newspapers. One of the Rangers, Nick Donnelly, was a baker by trade, and he soon built a Dutch oven and made bread for the Rangers. We pooled our flour and had fresh, warm bread every morning. This was so good and we ate so much of it that our allowance of flour would not last for the period issued, and Captain Roberts was compelled to order the bake oven torn down. Thereafter, the boys baked their own bread, and the flour lasted. Some of the Rangers had captured young bear cubs, and we had them in camp with us as pets. They grew rapidly and were soon big fellows and immensely popular with the boys. Sometimes a bear would break loose from its chain, and then all of us would turn out to hunt the escaped pet. Most often, we would soon find him seated in a tree, which he had climbed as soon as he had broken his shackles. And I cannot here forewarn mention the useful little pack mules that served the Rangers so long and so well. When the battalion was formed in 1874, a number of little bronco mules were secured for packing. They soon learned what was expected of them and followed the Rangers to hike dogs. Carrying a weight of 150 to 200 pounds, they would follow a scout of Rangers on the dead run right into the midst of the hottest fight with Indians or desperadoes. They seemed to take as much interest in such an engagement as the Rangers themselves. These little pack animals had as much curiosity as a child or a pet coon. In traveling along a road, they sometimes met a bunch of horses or several campers along the highway. Immediately, they would run over for a brief visit with the strangers, and when the Rangers had gone on 1,000 yards or more, would scamper up to us as fast as they could run. Later, when the Rangers drew in from the frontier and scouted in a more thickly settled country, the mules with their packs would march right up to strange horses and frighten them out of their wits. Once, in Austin, one of our mules calmly trotted up to a mule that was pulling a streetcar. As the pack burro would not give right of way, the streetcar mule shied to one side and pulled its conveyance completely off the track to the surprise of its driver. The tiny animals pulled off several stunts like this and caused so much complaint that Adjutant General Jones issued an order for all Rangers to catch and lead their pack mules when passing through a town. As soon as we were located in the new camp, Privates Neville, Bell, and Seeker obtained permission from Captain Roberts to visit Austin to buy a case of 10 Winchesters. Up to this time, the company was armed with a .50 caliber Sharps carbine. These guns would heat easily and thus were very inaccurate shooters. The state furnished this weapon to its Rangers at a cost of $17.50, and at that time furnished no other class of gun. The new center fire 1873 model Winchester had just appeared on the market and sold at $50 for the rifle and $40 for the carbine. A Ranger who wanted a Winchester had to pay for it out of his own pocket and supply his own ammunition as well, for the state of Texas only furnished cartridges for the Sharps gun. However, 10 men in Company D, myself included, were willing to pay the price to have a superior arm. I got carbine number 13,401, and for the next 6 years of my Ranger career, I never used any other weapon. I have killed almost every kind of game that is found in Texas, from the biggest old bull buffalo to a fox squirrel with this little. Winchester. Today, I still preserve it as a prized memento of the past. The boys were all anxious to try their new guns, and as Christmas approached, we decided to have a real Yuletide dinner. Ed Seeker and myself visited a big turkey roost on the head of Elm Creek and killed 7 big wild turkeys, and on our return, Seeker bagged a fine buck deer. J.W. Bell hunted on the San Saba and brought in 6 or 8 wild geese and about a dozen mallard ducks. Donnelly, the baker, cooked up the pies while Mrs. Roberts, wife of the captain, furnished the fruit cake. Some of the boys made eggnog, and altogether we had the finest Christmas dinner that ever graced the boards of a Ranger camp. The little frontier village of Menardville was not far away, and most of the Rangers visited it during Christmas week for the dancing. Jack Martin once remarked to Mrs. Roberts that there was very little society about a Ranger camp. She told the joke to him, and thereafter, as long as he lived, he was known as Society Jack. During the winter we laid out a race course and had much sport with our horses. But there was work as well as play that winter. Though Captain Roberts kept scouts in the field during the entire winter, they never discovered any Indian trails. The Rangers had not yet turned their attention to outlaws, so we were not burdened with chained prisoners as we were in after years. This winter camp on the San Saba was the most pleasant time in my service with the Rangers. The first week in April, 1876, we moved out of our winter quarters to a camp some 6 or 7 miles above Maynardville and located in a pecan grove on the banks of the San Saba. We were all glad to get into our tents again after 4 months spent in log cabins. I remember our first night at the new camp. The boys set out some hooks and caught 4 or 5 big yellow catfish weighing 25 or 30 pounds each, enough fish to last the 20 men several days. As the spring opened, Captain Roberts began sending out scouts to cut signs for Indians. I remember I was detailed on a scout that was commanded by a non-commissioned officer. We were ordered to scout as far north as the union of the Concho and Colorado rivers. After crossing the Brady Mountains, we struck a trail of Indians going out. The Native Americans had probably been raiding in San Saba or McCulloch counties. Their trail led west as straight to San Angelo as a bird could fly. Though the Indians were not numerous and had only a few horses, the trail was easily followed. As well as we could judge, the Native Americans had passed on a few days before we discovered their sign. We found where they had stolen some horses, for we picked up several pairs of hobbles that had been cut in two and left where they got the horses. At that time, there were several big cattle ranches in the Fort Concho country, and in going to and from water, the cattle entirely obliterated the trail. We worked hard for 2 days trying to find it, and then gave up the hunt. We needed the genius of Captain Roberts to help us out that time. On June 1st, 1876, the company was increased to 40 men. Some of the boys that had quit at Mason the fall before now re-entered the service. Especially do I remember that Mage Reynolds enlisted with Company D once more. During the summer of 1876, Major Jones planned a big scout out on the Pecos to strike the Lipans and Kickapoos a blow before they began raiding the white settlements. This scout started from Company D in July. The major drafted about 20 men from my company, his whole escort, Company A, of 30 men, and marched into Kerr County. Here he drafted part of Captain Coldwell's Company F, making his force total about 70 men with 3 wagons and about 20 pack mules. The column traveled down the Nueces, then by Fort Clark up the Devil's River to Beaver Lake. Here, Captain Ira Long with 20 men and the wagon train was sent up the San Antonio and El Paso Road to Old Fort Lancaster on the Pecos, where he was to await the arrival of Major Jones with the main force. From Beaver Lake, the major with 50 men and the 20 pack mules turned southwest and traveled down Johnston's Run to the Schaefer Crossing on the Pecos. From this crossing, we scouted up the Pecos to the mouth of Independence Creek. The country through this section was very rough, but very beautiful. We saw several old abandoned Indian camps, especially at the mouth of the creek. Here we found the pits and the scaffolds upon which the Native Americans had dried their meat, also evidence that many deer hide had been dressed and made into buckskin. Bows and arrows had also been manufactured in these camps. From this section, the Indians had been gone probably a month or more. After 10 days of scouting, we joined Captain Long at Fort Lancaster and marched up Live Oak Creek to its head. Here we prepared to cross that big stretch of tableland between the Pecos and the headwaters of the South Concho. We filled what barrels we had with water, topped out from the creek, and made about 10 miles into the plains by night, and made a dry camp. We got an early start the next day and traveled until night without finding water. The stock suffered greatly from thirst, and the men had only a little water in their canteens. All the land ponds had been dry for 2 weeks or more, and I saw 12 heads of buffalo that had bogged and died in one of them. Here we found an old abandoned Indian camp where the Native Americans had dressed many antelope hides. At one old bent mesquite tree, the antelope hair was a foot deep, with 30 or 40 skulls scattered about. By the second morning, both men and horses were suffering a great deal from thirst, and Major Jones gave orders to begin march at 4 a.m. We got away on time and reached water on the South Concho at 2 p.m., the third day out from Live Oak Creek. As soon as we got near the water, we found a number of straggling buffalo and killed 2, thus securing a supply of fresh meat. We camped for 2 days in this water and then marched back to Company D by easy stages. Here, Major Jones turned back up the line with his escort after being out on this scout about a month. On his return toward the Rio Grande, Major Jones reached Company D the last week in August and camped with us until September 1st, the end of the fiscal year for the Rangers. On this date, many men would quit service to retire to private life, while some would join other companies and new recruits be sworn into the service. This reorganization usually required 2 or 3 days. Nearly every ranger in the battalion was anxious to be at some time a member of Major Jones's escort company. The escort company was not assigned a stationary post, nor did it endeavor to cover a given strip of territory. Its most important duty was to escort the major on his periodic journeys of inspection to the other companies along the line. The escort always wintered in the South and made about 4 yearly tours of the frontier from company to company, taking part in such scouts as the major might select and being assigned to such extraordinary duty as might arise. In 1874, when the Frontier Battalion was first formed, Major Jones recruited his escort from a detail of 5 men from each of the other companies. However, in practice, this led to some confusion and envy in the commands, so Major Jones found it expedient to have a regular escort company, so he selected Company A for that purpose. This remained his escort until he was promoted to Adjutant General. In September 1876, there were several vacancies in Major Jones's escort, and several old Company D boys, among them Mage Reynolds, Charles Neville, Jack Martin, Bill Clements, and Tom Gillespie, wished to enlist in Company A. They wanted me to go with them, but I hesitated to leave Captain Roberts. My friends then explained that we could see a lot more country on the escort than we could in a stationary company, that we would probably be stationed down on the Rio Grande that winter, and going up the line in the spring would see thousands of buffalo. This buffalo proposition caught me, and I went with the boys. After 15 months ranging with Captain Roberts, I now joined Company A. Early in September, Major Jones marched his escort down to within 5 or 6 miles of San Antonio and camped us on the Salado while he went into Austin. By the 1st of October, he was back in camp and started up the line on his last visit to the different companies before winter set in. At that time, Major John B. Jones was a small man, probably not more than 5 feet 7 inches tall, and weighed about 125 pounds. He had very dark hair and eyes and a heavy dark mustache. He was quick in action, though small in stature, and was an excellent horseman, riding very erect in the saddle. The major was born in Fairfield District, South Carolina, in 1834, but emigrated to Texas with his father when he was only 4 years old. He was prominent in Texas state affairs from a very early age and served gallantly with the Confederate Army during the Civil War. On the accession of Governor Koch in 1874, he was appointed to command the Frontier Battalion of 6 companies of Texas Rangers. From his appointment until his death in Austin in 1881, Major Jones was constantly engaged in repulsing bloody raids of Indians, rounding up outlaws, and making Texas secure and safe for the industrious and peaceful citizens. In this work, his wonderful tact, judgment, coolness, and courage found ample scope. From the organization of the battalion in 1874 until Major Jones was made Adjutant General, Dr. Nicholson was always with him. The doctor was a quaint old bachelor who loved his toddy. The boys would sometimes get him as full as a goose, and the Major would give the doctor some vicious looks at such times. Dr. Nicholson was a great favorite with all the men, and it is said he knew every good place for buttermilk, butter, milk, and eggs from Rio Grande City to Red River, a trifling distance of 800 miles. The doctor always messed with Major Jones, and mounted on a fine horse, traveled by his side. I don't think Dr. Nicholson ever issued a handful of pills to the boys during the year. He was just with us in case he was needed. When the escort was disbanded, he retired to private life at Del Rio, Texas, and finally died there. This inspection tour was a wonderful experience for me. The weather was cool and bracing, and the horses had had a month's rest. We had with us a quartet of musicians, among them a violinist, a guitar player, and a banjo picker, and after the day's march, the players would often gather around the campfire and give us a concert. The Major would frequently walk down and listen to the music. Nor was music our only amusement. Major Jones had provided his escort with a fish seine, and when we were camped on a big creek or river, the boys would unroll the net, make a haul, and sometimes catch enough fish to supply the 30 men several days. When recruited to its full strength, Company A consisted of a captain, orderly sergeant, second sergeant, first and second corporals, and 26 privates. 2 4-mule wagons hauled the camp equipment, rations for the men and grain for the horses. 1 light wagon drawn by 2 mules and driven by George, the black individual cook, carried the mess outfit, bedding, tent, etc. of Major Jones and Dr. Nicholson. Each morning at roll call, the orderly sergeant detailed a guard of 9 men and 1 non-commissioned officer to guard for 24 hours. When ready to begin our day's journey, the company was formed in line and the men counted off by 4s. On the march, Major Jones and Dr. Nicholson rode in front, followed by the captain of the company, the orderly sergeant, and the men in double file. Following these came the wagons. An advance guard of 2 men preceded the column about 1/2 mile. 4 men, known as flankers, 2 on each side of the company, paralleled the column at a distance of 1/2 to 1 mile, depending on the nature of the country. In a rough, wooded section, the flankers traveled close in, but in an open country they sometimes spread out quite a distance. The non-commissioned officer with the remaining guard covered the rear and brought up the pack mules. Thus protected, it was almost impossible for the command to be surprised by Indians. At one time, Major Jones had with him 2 Tonka Indians as guides. For protection, this tribe lived near Fort Griffin, a large military post. One of these old braves, known as Jim, had been given an old worn-out army coat with the shoulder straps of a general upon it. Jim wore this coat tightly buttoned up and marched at the head of the column with as much dignity and importance as a general-in-chief. His companion wore a high-crowned beaver stovepipe hat with the top gone and carried an old umbrella that someone had given him. Fitted out in this ridiculous and unique manner, he marched for days with the umbrella over him. Think of an Indian shading himself from the sun. Major Jones never paid much attention to these Indians unless he wished to inquire about the lay of the country or the distance to some waterhole. They did pretty much as they pleased, sometimes riding in front with the major, sometimes with the guard, and at others with the men. These old Native Americans were a constant source of amusement to the boys. Jim and his pal were good hunters, but as lazy as could be. They got into the habit of killing a buffalo late in the evening when they knew it was almost time to pitch camp, cutting out just enough meat for themselves and letting the remainder go to waste. The major told these lazy bones when they killed a buffalo he wanted to know of it so he could secure the meat for the company. The Tonks paid no attention to this request and late one evening came into camp with 5 or 6 pounds of buffalo meat. The orderly sergeant spied them, so he walked over to Major Jones and said, "Major, those 2 old Tonkawas are back in camp with just enough meat for themselves." "Sergeant, you get a pack mule, take a file of men with you, and make those Indians saddle their horses and go with you to get that buffalo," the major commanded, determined that his order should be obeyed by the Indians. The sergeant went to the Indians, who were busy roasting their meat, and told them what the major had said. Jim declared that he was tired, and did not wish to go. The non-commissioned officer replied that that made no difference and commanded him and his pal to get their ponies and lead the way to the dead buffalo. "Maybe so 10 miles to Buffalo," protested Jim, trying to avoid going. The sergeant knew they were lying, for of all the Indians that ever inhabited Texas, the Tonkawas were the biggest cowards. Just mention the Comanches or Kiowas to them, and they would have a chill. It was well known that the Tonks would not venture very far away from the protection of the Rangers for fear of being killed by their enemies. As soon as they knew they had to do as ordered, they mounted their ponies and led the sergeant over a little hill, and in a valley not more than half a mile from camp was the fine, fat buffalo the Indians had killed. The animal was soon skinned and brought into camp, where all had plenty of fresh meat. These Tonks were as simple as children and as suspicious as black individuals. The weather had been hot and dry for several days. Old Jim thereupon killed some hawks with his bow and arrows, plaited the long tail and wing feathers into his pony's mane and tail, and said it would make heap rain. Sure enough, in 3 or 4 days a hard thunder shower came up and thoroughly wet everybody on the march. Jim, with only his old officer's coat for protection, was drenched to the skin, and his pony looked like a drowned rat. The wood, grass, everything was wet. Jim stood by, shivering with the cold, and watched the boys use up almost their last match trying to make a fire. Suddenly, with a look of disgust, he ran up to his horse, which was standing near, and plucked every hawk feather out of the animal's tail and mane, and throwing them on the ground, stamped upon them violently, as if that would stop the rain. After the escort had crossed the Colorado River on its way northward, we found an advance guard of buffalo on its way south, and it was an easy matter to keep the company in fresh meat. We spent about 1 week with Company B on the Upper Brazos, then turned south again to make our winter camp near Old Freotown in Frio County. It was November now and freezing hard every night. The last guard would call the camp early, so we generally had breakfast and were ready to move southward by daylight. We did not stop a single time for dinner on this return trip, just traveled at a steady gait all day long, without dinner until nearly night. We all wondered why we marched the livelong day without dinner, but it was not until many years afterward, when I became a Mason, that I learned the reason for our forced marches. Major Jones was in line to be made Most Worshipful Grand Master of Masons in Texas, and he had to be in Houston on the first Tuesday in December for the annual meeting of the Most Worshipful Grand Lodge of Texas. If there were other Masons in the company besides Major Jones, I never knew it. At this time, we had a commander of the escort, Lieutenant Benton. He was in bad health and rode most of the way back in one of the wagons. On arriving at the end of the line, he tendered his resignation and was succeeded by Captain Neil Coldwell. The company camped for the winter on Elm Creek, 3 miles southwest of Old Frio Town. Captain Neil Coldwell was born in Dade County, Missouri, in May 1844, and served gallantly throughout the Civil War in the 32nd Regiment, Texas Cavalry, commanded by Colonel W. P. Woods. At the organization of the Frontier Battalion in 1874, Neil Coldwell was commissioned captain of Company F. It is difficult in a single sketch to do Captain Coldwell justice or convey any correct idea of what he accomplished as a Texas Ranger. The station of Company F, the southernmost company of the line, was the most unfavorable that could well be given him. His scouting grounds were the head of the Guadalupe, Nueces, Llanos, and Devil's Rivers, the roughest and most difficult part of South Texas in which to pursue Indians, yet he held them in check and finally drove them out of that part of the state. Chapter 7. The Horrell-Higgins Feud. Table of Contents. By the end of the year, 1876, the Indians had been pretty well pushed back off the frontier, so that there were very few fights with the Native Americans after 1877. From the spring of 1877 onward, the Rangers were transformed into what might properly be called mounted state police, and accordingly turned their attention to ridding the frontier of the outlaws that infested nearly every part of Texas. During the winter of 1876 to 77, Captain Neil Coldwell broke up a band of thieves that was operating in the northwestern part of Atascosa County. I remember helping him capture a man named Wolf. He was wanted for murder, and we made several scouts after him before we succeeded in landing him safely in irons. In April 1877, Major Jones reached Coldwell's company and at once made arrangements to march up the line on a visit of inspection. When the Major reached the headwaters of the South Llano River, he halted his escort and detailed several small scouting parties of 5 or 6 men, each with orders to arrest every man that could not give a good account of himself. One scout was sent down the South Llano, a second down Johnson's Fork, while a third was ordered over the divide with instructions to hit the head of the North Llano and sweep down that river, all 3 parties to rejoin Major Jones and the main escort near where Junction City now stands. In these outlaw raids, some 50 or 60 men were arrested and brought in. Many of the suspects were released upon examination, but I remember one scout brought in 2 escaped convicts who had been captured up on Copperas Creek. We bagged several men wanted for murder and some horse and cattle thieves. Old Kimball County never had such a cleanup of bandits in her history. While these prisoners were being held in camp, other scouts were sent out in the northern part of the county with orders to sweep Bear Creek, Gentry, Red Creek, Big and Little Saline, to cross the San Saba River in Menard County and sweep up that stream from Old Peg Leg Station to Menard. Many more suspects were caught in this haul. With a party of scouts, I was detailed on a mission to Fort McCavitt, at that time one of the big military posts on the frontier. Many hard characters and gamblers gathered about these posts to fleece the soldiers out of their easy-made money. We made several arrests here and camped for noon 1 mile below the government post on the San Saba River. During the dinner hour, my horse, a gray, lying down to wallow, rolled on some broken beer bottles and cut his back so badly that he was unfit for use for some time. When the escort moved north, I was left with Old Company D until the return of Company A on its return march some 6 weeks later. I thereby missed some of the exciting scouts that took place on the march north. When Major Jones reached Coleman City, he found orders from Governor Koch to send a scout of rangers to Lampasas County to help the civil authorities suppress a war known as the Horrell-Higgins feud. 2nd Sergeant N. O. Reynolds was detached from Company A and with 10 men ordered to proceed to Lampasas and report to the sheriff of that county. After leaving Coleman, Major Jones visited the northernmost ranger company and began his return march. This was to be his last trip with his escort, for immediately upon his return to Austin, he was commissioned Adjutant General of Texas. As there was no longer a major of the battalion, there was no need of an escort, so Old Company A took its place on the line as a stationary company. Captain Neil Coldwell was ultimately made quartermaster of the battalion, and I believe ranked as major. I was picked up at Company D by the escort on their return march and was with Company A when it was made a stationary command and located in Frio County. In the latter part of 1877, during the late summer, a party of filibusters under command of a Mexican general named Winkler assembled in Maverick County near Eagle Pass and prepared to invade Mexico. Captain Coldwell, then commanding Company A, was ordered to the Rio Grande to break up the expedition. This he did by arresting more than 50 participants. I was with him on this expedition and saw much border service during this summer. I remember a scout I was called upon to make with Captain Coldwell over in Bandera County. The captain took with him John Parker, Hawk Roberts, and myself. In 1 week's time, we caught some 10 or 12 fugitives from justice and literally filled the little old jail at Bandera. Captain Coldwell detailed Hawk Roberts and myself to capture an especially bad man wanted in Burnett County for murder. The captain warned us to take no chances with this man. That meant to kill him if he hesitated about surrendering. I can't remember this murderer's name at this late date, but I recall perfectly the details of his capture. Sheriff Jack Hamilton of Bandera County sent a guide to show us where this fugitive lived. The guide led us some 15 miles northwest of Bandera and finally pointed out the house in which the murderer was supposed to be. He then refused to go any farther, saying he did not want any of this man's game, for the fellow had just stood off a deputy sheriff and made him hike it back to Bandera. It was almost night when we reached the house, so Roberts and I decided to wait until morning before attempting the arrest. We staked our horses, lay down on our saddle blankets without supper, and slept soundly till dawn. As soon as it was daylight, we rode over near the house, dismounted, slipped up, and unannounced stepped right inside the room. The man we wanted was sleeping on a pallet with a big white-handled .45 near his head. Hawk Roberts kicked the pistol out of the man's reach. The noise awakened the sleeper, and he opened his eyes to find himself looking into the business ends of 2 Winchesters held within a foot of his head. Of course he surrendered without a fight. His wife, who was sleeping in a bed in the same room, jumped out of it and heaped all kinds of abuse on us for entering her home without ceremony. She was especially bitter against Sheriff Hamilton, who, she said, had promised to notify her husband when he was wanted so he could come in and give himself up. She indignantly advised her husband to give old Sheriff Hamilton a de good whipping the first chance he had. While Company A was rounding up outlaws along the border, Sergeant Reynolds was covering himself with glory in the north. Upon reaching Lampasas and reporting to the sheriff as ordered by Major Jones, the sergeant was told that the Horrell boys were living on the Sulphur Fork of the Lampasas River and were defying the authorities to arrest them. The Horrells were native Texans and had been raised on the frontier. These brothers, of which 5 were involved in the feud, the 6th, John Horrell, had been killed at Las Cruces, New Mexico previously, were expert riders, and, having grown up with firearms in their hands, were as quick as chained lightning with either Winchester or pistol. Sam Horrell, the eldest, was married and had a large family of children. He was a farmer and lived a quiet life on the Lampasas River. The other 4 boys, Mart, Tom, Merritt, and Ben, were all cattlemen. They stood well in the community, but were considered dangerous when aroused. At this time, Lampasas was a frontier town and wide open as far as saloons and gambling were concerned. The Horrells, like most cattlemen of the period, loved to congregate in town, go to the saloons, and have a good time, perhaps drink too much, and sometimes at night shoot up the town for fun, as they termed it. Some of the more pious and more settled citizens of the town did not approve of these night brawls, and called upon Governor Edmund J. Davis, provisional governor in 1873, to give them protection. Governor Davis had formed in Texas a state police. Naturally, they were rank Republicans, and many of them were termed carpetbaggers. This body was never popular in Texas, especially as many of the force were black individuals. In answer to the call of the citizens, Governor Davis dispatched Captain Williams with 3 white men and 1 black individual to Lampasas. On the way up, Captain Williams met several freighters going to Austin and stopped one of them, Tedford Bean, to ask the distance to Lampasas. The captain had been drinking, and he told Mr. Bean he was going to town to clean up those damn Horrell boys. The little squad of police reached Lampasas about 3 p.m., hitched its horses to some live oak trees on the public plaza, left the black individual to guard them, and then made a beeline to Jerry Scott's saloon on the west side of the square. Mart, Tom, and Merritt Horrell, with some 10 or 15 cowmen, were in the saloon drinking, playing billiards, and generally having a good time. One man was picking a banjo, and another was playing a fiddle. Captain Williams, an exceedingly brave but unwise man, took in the situation at a glance as he walked up to the bar and called for drinks. He turned to Bill Bowen, a brother-in-law to Merritt Horrell, and said, "I believe you have a 6-shooter. I will arrest you." "Bill, you have done nothing and need not be arrested if you don't want to," interrupted Mart Horrell. Like a flash of lightning, Captain Williams pulled his pistol and fired on Mart Horrell, wounding him badly. The Horrell boys drew their guns and began to fight. Captain Williams and one of his men, Dr. Daniels, were shot down in the saloon. William Cherry was killed just outside the door, and Andrew Melville was fatally wounded as he was trying to escape. He reached the old Huling Hotel, where he died later. At the first crack of a pistol, the black individual police mounted his horse and made a John Gilpin ride for Austin. Thus, within the twinkling of an eye, 4 state police were killed and only one of the Horrells wounded. Tom and Merritt Horrell carried the wounded Mart to their mother's home, some 200 yards from Scott's saloon, then mounted their horses and rode away. Great excitement prevailed in the town. The state militia was called out, and Governor Davis hurried other state police to Lampasas. They scoured the country for the Horrell boys, but to no avail. Mart Horrell and Jerry Scott were arrested and carried to Georgetown, Williamson County, and placed in jail. Mart Horrell's wife went to the jail to nurse her husband and, of course, kept her brothers-in-law informed as to Mart's condition. As soon as he was well, the Horrell boys made up a party and rode to Williamson County and assaulted the jail at night. The citizens and officers of Georgetown, taken unawares, put up a stiff fight, but the Horrells had 10 or 15 well-organized and armed men with them. They took stations at all approaches to the jail and kept up a steady fire with their Winchesters at anyone who showed up to oppose them. Mr. A.S. Fisher, a prominent lawyer of the town, took an active hand in the fight and was badly wounded. Bill Bowen was slightly hurt while battering in the jail door with a sledgehammer. Mart Horrell and Jerry Scott were liberated and rode off with their rescuers. By the next evening, the Horrells were back on Lucy's Creek. They at once made arrangements to leave the country and go to New Mexico. They had gathered about them Bill and Tom Bowen, John Dixon, Ben Turner, and 6 or 8 other men as desperate and dangerous as themselves. They were so formidable that they no longer attempted to hide, but openly and without hindrance gathered their cattle, sold the remnant to Cooksey and Clayton to be delivered to them in Coleman County. They even notified the sheriff of Lampasas County just what day they would pass with their herd through Russell Gap, but they were not molested. As a cowboy, I had worked for Cooksey and Clayton and was with them when they delivered cattle to the Horrell boys on Home Creek, Coleman County. I had dinner in camp with the outlaws, and they made no effort to hide from the authorities. I remember them talking about their camps with Winchesters across their laps. When all was ready, the Horrells moved slowly out of the country with their families and cattle, and finally reached New Mexico, settling on the head of the Hondo River in Lincoln County. They had not been at their new home many months before Ben Horrell was shot and killed at a fandango near Old Fort Stanton. Ben's brothers at once repaired the dance hall and killed 8 Mexicans and 1 woman. This brought on a war between the Horrell boys and the Mexican population along the Hondo River, and it is said that in the fights that followed, 30 or 40 Mexicans were killed between Fort Stanton and Roswell. In one of those pitched battles, Ben Turner was killed. Turner was prominent in all of the fights staged by the Horrells, was with them when Captain Williams was killed, and was one of the assaulting party in the Georgetown jail. His death was keenly felt by his companions. Having now outlawed themselves in New Mexico, the Horrells could no longer stay in that country. They turned back to Texas and next year showed up at their old haunts in Lampasas County. The shock of the Civil War was beginning to subside, and the state of Texas was then under civil government with a Democratic governor in office. The friends of the Horrells advised them to surrender to the authorities and be tried for the killing of Captain Williams and his men. They were assured a fair trial by the best citizens of Lampasas County. Accordingly, the Horrells gave up, and upon trial were acquitted of the charges against them. The Horrells had not long been at ease before Merritt, the youngest of the brothers, was accused by Pink Higgins of unlawfully handling his cattle. Shortly afterward, while Merritt was seated unarmed in a chair in the old Jerry Scott saloon, Pink Higgins stepped to the back door of the place and shot him to death. Thus Merritt met his death in the same saloon where 4 years before he had been a party to the killing of Captain Williams. At this time, Mart and Tom Horrell were living down on Sulphur Fork of Lampasas River. The news of their brother's death was quickly carried to them. They armed themselves and started a run for Lampasas. This move had been anticipated by the Pink Higgins party. They waylaid the Horrell boys outside the town and at their first fire killed Tom Horrell's horse and badly wounded Mart. Tom advanced single-handed on the attackers and put them to flight. He then partly supported and partly carried his brother to the home of Mr. Tinnins, a neighbor, where a doctor was hurried to the wounded man. Thus old Lampasas County was again the scene of war, with Mart, Tom, and Sam Harrell, Bill and Tom Bowen, John Dixon and Bill Crabtree on one side, and Pink Higgins, Bob Mitchell and their friends on the other. These two factions met in the town of Lampasas, and a furious battle followed. A man was killed on each side, and the population greatly endangered. Hence the governor's order to Major Jones to send rangers to the aid of the officers at Lampasas. When Sergeant N.O. Reynolds reported to the sheriff of Lampasas, he was informed that the Horrell boys were living 10 miles east of Lampasas and had 10 or 12 desperate men with them, so that it meant certain death to anyone making an attempt to capture them. "But, Mr. Sheriff, I am sent here to effect the capture of all offenders against the law, and it is my duty to at least make the attempt," replied the brave Reynolds. "These men have never been arrested," declared Sheriff Sweet, "and it is my honest opinion they cannot be." Reynolds then asked if the sheriff would send a guide to show him where the Horrells lived. The rangers, under the intrepid Reynolds, left Lampasas late in the night, and finally the guide pointed at a flickering light about a mile off. "This is where the Horrell boys live. I am going back to town," he said. When asked if he would not accompany the rangers to the house, the guide replied, "No, not for $1 million." With that he turned his horse and rode away. Reynolds thought it would be best to wait until daylight before attempting the arrest. He planned to surprise the outlaws, if such a thing were possible, but if the rangers were discovered and an engagement came on, they were to fight to the last man. As soon as dawn broke, the rangers wended their way on foot to the Horrell brothers' ranch. It was a moment of great anxiety as they approached the house, but not a sound was heard, not a dog barking. Sergeant Reynolds and his men tiptoed right into the room in which the Horrells were sleeping. Some of the men were on pallets on the floor, while others slept in beds in the one big room. Each ranger pointed a cocked Winchester at the head of a sleeper. Reynolds then spoke to Mart Harrell. At the sound of his voice every man sat up in bed and found himself looking into the muzzle of a gun. The sergeant quickly explained that he was a ranger and had come to arrest them. Mart replied they could not surrender, and Tom Horrell said it would be better to die fighting than to be mobbed. This gave Reynolds his cue. He warned the outlaws that if anything was started, there would be 12 dead men in that house in 1 minute, and advised them to listen to what he had to say. He then guaranteed the Horrells upon his honor that he would not turn them over to the sheriff to be put in jail and mobbed, but promised he would guard them in his camp until they could secure a preliminary examination and give bond. "Boys, this seems reasonable," said Mart Horrell, rising to his feet. "I believe these rangers can be relied upon to protect us. Besides, this fight has been thrust upon us. If we can get a hearing, we can give bond." They all agreed finally to this proposition of Sergeant Reynolds and laid down their arms, mounted their horses, and under guard of the rangers were marched into the town of Lampasas. The news of the capture of the Horrells spread like wildfire through the town and country. Hundreds of people flocked to Lampasas to see Sergeant Reynolds, the man that had accomplished the impossible in rounding up the most desperate band of men that ever lived. The news was rushed to Austin, and General Jones himself hurried to the scene. This act of Sergeant Reynolds covered him with glory and brought to his name imperishable renown. He was at once commissioned First Lieutenant, commanding Company E. The Horrell boys were admitted to bond after a preliminary hearing. After their release, Mart Horrell came to Lieutenant Reynolds and feelingly thanked him for carrying out his promise. With tears streaming down his face, he grasped the lieutenant's hand and said, "You are undoubtedly the bravest man in the world today." These unfortunate men were later shot to death in the Meridian jail. The Higgins and Mitchell parties surrendered to the authorities. Pink Higgins was tried and acquitted of the murder of Merritt Horrell. This ended the feud, but it started Lieutenant Reynolds on a new and important phase of his career as a ranger. Chapter 8. Service with Reynolds, the Intrepid. Table of Contents. As soon as Sergeant Reynolds was commissioned first lieutenant, he was placed in command of Company E, then stationed in Coleman County, but immediately ordered to Lampasas. At this time, Captain Sparks resigned the command of Company C, and this company was also ordered to report to Lieutenant Reynolds at the same town. Late in August, the two commands went into camp at Hancock Springs. Major Jones then authorized Lieutenant Reynolds to pick such men as he desired from these two companies for his own company, and either discharge or transfer the remainder to other commands. No other officer in the battalion, I believe, was ever accorded this privilege. Lieutenant Reynolds had a week or 10 days in which to make his selection, so he studied the muster rolls of the companies carefully. He had ranged under such great captains as Perry, D.W. Roberts, Neil Coldwell, and Major Jones himself. He knew what qualities were needed in a good ranger and made his selections accordingly. From Old Company A, Reynolds selected C.L. Neville, Tom Gillespie, Shape Rogers, Jack Martin, John Gibbs, W.T. Clements, and 4 others whose names I do not now remember. These were the scouts that had helped him capture the Horrells, and naturally were his first choice. From Company E came Dick Ware, who 1 year later killed the noted train robber, Sam Bass, then served Mitchell County as its first sheriff for many years, and finally became United States Marshal for the Western District of Texas under President Cleveland's administration. Henry Thomas, Miller Moreland, George Arnett, and other Company E boys were selected. Henry Maltimore, Ben and Doc Carter, Bill Derrick, Chris Connor, Henry McGee, Abe Anglin, J.W. Warren, Dave Ligon, Lo Hughes, George, Hog Hughes, and others were picked from Company C. When he had exhausted the two companies, Reynolds turned to General Jones and said, "There is a ranger down on the Rio Grande in Neil Coldwell's company that I want." "Who is it?" asked the general. "Private Jim Gillett." "You shall have him," promised General Jones. "I will send an order to Captain Coldwell tonight to have Gillett report to you here." It was late in the evening when Company A's mail came in from Freotown, but Captain Coldwell sent for me as soon as General Jones's order arrived and told me that I must leave the company next morning and report to the Adjutant General at Austin. I was nonplussed, for I did not know what the order meant. Out on the frontier, where we then were operating, we seldom read newspapers or heard what the other companies were doing, so I did not even know that Reynolds had captured the Horrell boys and had been commissioned to command Company E. The following morning, I bade Captain Coldwell and the company "A boys goodbye," and started on my long ride to Austin. As I jogged along, I asked myself many hundred times why I was ordered to report at Austin, and, boylike, it made me nervous and uneasy. It took me 2 days to reach San Antonio and 3 more to get to Austin. I arrived in the latter town just at nightfall, but I was at the Adjutant General's office as soon as it opened the next morning. Presently, General Jones entered with some officers of the state militia. He shook hands with me and invited me to be seated, saying he had some business to attend to for the moment. It was probably an hour before the officers left, and the general could turn to me. He very kindly inquired as to my trip, and asked about Captain Coldwell and the company. He then told me about the arrest of the Horrell boys and Sergeant Reynolds's commission as First Lieutenant commanding Company E. Vice Lieutenant Foster resigned. He explained Reynolds had requested that I be attached to his command, and ordered me to report to my new commander in Lampasas without delay. I excused myself at once and lost no time in getting my horse out of the livery stable and resuming my way. A great load was lifted from my mind, and I was about as happy as a boy could be. I sang and whistled all the way to Liberty Hill, 30 miles from Austin. The following day, about 2 p.m. rode into Reynolds's camp at Hancock Springs. I attracted some attention as I rode in, for I wore a big Mexican hat mounted with silver, a buckskin jacket fringed from shoulder to elbow with a bunch of flowers braided in highly colored silk on its back. On my heels were enormous Mexican spurs. I never saw a ranger sent to the Rio Grande for the first time that did not rig himself out in some such outlandish attire, only to discard it a few weeks later, never to wear it again. I was no exception, and I think every man in camp tried on my hat. Lieutenant Reynolds selected C. L. Neville for first sergeant, Henry W. McGee as second sergeant, and J. W. Warren and L. W. Connor first and second corporals, respectively. On September 1st, 1877, the company was sworn in. The new command was the most formidable body of men I had ever seen. Our commander, Lieutenant Reynolds, was over 6 feet tall and weighed probably 175 pounds. He was a very handsome man, a perfect blonde with steel blue eyes and a long, light mustache. At that time, he was about 30 years of age, vigorous in mind and body, and had a massive determination to succeed as a ranger. His mind was original, bold, profound, and quick, with a will that no obstacle could daunt. He was the best ranger in the world. There was never another like him. The lieutenant was a native of Missouri and was always known as Major or Mage Reynolds. It was said that Reynolds, though a mere boy, had served with the Confederates in the latter part of the Civil War. He was one of a party that captured a troop of Federal cavalry, the majority of which was well supplied with clothing. The captors, however, were very scantily clad, and Reynolds appropriated the major's uniform, hence his nickname, Mage. In later years, when I had grown more intimate with him, and was probably closer to him than any other I mentioned this story, he neither affirmed nor denied it, declaring he was a Missourian by birth, a bootmaker by trade, and that his early history could interest no one. First Sergeant Neville was 6 feet and 1 inch in height and weighed 185 pounds. All the non-commissioned officers were at least 6 feet tall and built in proportion, and many of the privates were from 5 feet 11 inches to 6 feet in height. I was probably the lightest man in the company, being only 5 feet 9 inches and weighing 140 pounds. When the company's roster was complete, Lieutenant Reynolds had but 28 men, lacking 2, of his full complement of 30. The company was then ordered to Austin, but before being assigned to its position on the frontier, the lieutenant enlisted John and Will Bannister, 2 celebrated frontiersmen. They were old cowboys, splendid shots, and well acquainted with every part of Kimball, Menard, Mason, and Kerr counties, in which Company E was destined to operate. In appearance and ability, this company compared favorably with any 30 Rangers ever sent to the Texas frontier. Nearly every member of the company had had more or less experience as an officer, and all were exceedingly fine marksmen. Sergeant Henry McGee had been Marshal of Waco and had figured in several pistol duels in that city. Dave Ligon, the oldest man in the command, had been a Confederate soldier and had served with General Forrest's cavalry. In the summer of 1877, Lieutenant Armstrong of Captain Hall's company, assisted by Detective Jack Duncan of Dallas, Texas, captured the notorious John Wesley Hardin. It has been said that Texas, the largest state in the Union, has never produced a real world's champion at anything. Surely such critics overlooked Hardin, the champion desperado of the world. His life is too well known in Texas for me to go into detail, but according to his own story, which I have before me, he killed no fewer than 27 men, the last being Charlie Webb, Deputy Sheriff of Brown County, Texas. So notorious had Hardin become that the state of Texas offered a $4,000 reward for his capture. Hardin had left Texas and at the time of his capture was in Florida. His captors arrested and overpowered him while he was sitting in a passenger coach. In September 1877, Sheriff Wilson of Comanche County, in whose jurisdiction Hardin had killed Webb, came to Austin to convey the prisoner to Comanche for trial. Wilson requested the governor for an escort of Rangers. Lieutenant Reynolds' company, being in Austin at the time, was ordered to accompany Wilson and protect Hardin from mob violence. This was the first work assigned to Company E under its new commander. The day we left Austin, between 1,000 and 2,000 people gathered about the Travis County Jail to see this notorious desperado. The Rangers were drawn up just outside the jail, and Henry Thomas and myself were ordered to enter the prison and escort Hardin out. Heavily shackled and handcuffed, the prisoner walked very slowly between us. The boy that had sold fish on the streets of Austin was now guarding the most desperate criminal in Texas. It was glory enough for me. At his trial, Hardin was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in the penitentiary. He appealed his case and was returned to Travis County for safekeeping. The verdict of the trial court was sustained, and 1 year later, in September 1878, Lieutenant Reynolds's company was ordered to take Hardin back to Comanche County for sentencing. There was no railroad at Comanche at that time, so a detachment of Rangers, myself among them, escorted Hardin to the penitentiary. There were 10 or 12 indictments still pending against him for murder in various counties, but they were never prosecuted. Hardin served 17 years on his sentence, and while in prison studied law. Governor Hogg pardoned him in 1894 and restored him to full citizenship. In transmitting him the governor's pardon, Judge W. S. Fly, Associate Justice of the Court of Appeals, wrote Hardin as follows. Dear Sir, enclosed, I send you a full pardon from the Governor of Texas. I congratulate you on its reception and trust that it is the day of dawn of a bright and peaceful future. There is time to retrieve a lost past. Turn your back upon it with all its suffering and sorrow, and fix your eyes upon the future with the determination to make yourself an honorable and useful member of society. The hand of every true man will be extended to assist you in your upward course, and I trust that the name of Hardin will in the future be associated with the performance of deeds that will ennoble his family and be a blessing to humanity. Have you ever read Victor Hugo's masterpiece, Les Miserables? If not, you ought to read it. It paints in graphic words the life of one who had tasted the bitterest dregs of life's cup, but in his Christian manhood rose about it, almost like a god, and left behind him a path luminous with good deeds. With the best wishes for your welfare and happiness, I am, yours very truly, W. S. Fly. Despite all the kind advice given him by eminent lawyers and citizens, Hardin was unequal to the task of becoming a useful man. He practiced law for a time in Gonzales, then drifted away to El Paso, where he began drinking and gambling. On August 19, 1895, Hardin was standing at a bar shaking dice when John Selman, constable of Precinct No. 1, approached him from behind and, placing a pistol to the back of Hardin's head, blew his brains out. Though posing as an officer, Selman was himself an outlaw and a murderer of the worst kind. He killed Hardin for the notoriety it would bring him, and nothing more. After delivering Hardin to the sheriff of Travis County in 1877, Lieutenant Reynolds was ordered to Kimball County for duty. Of all the counties in Texas at that time, Kimball was the most popular with outlaws and criminals, for it was situated south of Menard County on the North and South Llano rivers, with cedar, pecan, and mesquite timber in which to hide, while the streams and mountains furnished abundance of fish and game for subsistence. Up on the South Llano lived old Jimmy Dublin. He had a large family of children, most of them grown. The eldest of his sons, Dick, or Richard as he was known, and a friend, Ace Langford, killed 2 men at a country store in Langford's Cove, Coryell County, Texas. The state offered $500 for the arrest of Dublin, and the county of Coryell an additional $200. To escape capture, Dick and his companion fled west into Kimball County. While I was working as a cowboy with Joe Franks in the fall of 1873, I became acquainted with the 2 murderers, for they attached themselves to our outfit. They were always armed and constantly on the watch out for fear of arrest. Dublin was a large man, stout, dark-complexioned, and looked more like the bully of a prize ring than the cowman he was. I often heard him say he would never surrender. While cow-hunting with us, he discovered that the naturally brushy and tangled county of Kimball would offer shelter for such as he, and persuaded his father to move out into that county. Dublin had not lived long in Kimball County before another son, Del Dublin, killed Jim Williams, a neighbor. Thus 2 of the Dublin boys were on the dodge, charged with murder. They were supposed to be hiding near their father's home. Bill Allison, Stark Reynolds, and a number of bandits, horse and cattle thieves and murderers, were known to be in Kimball County, so Lieutenant Reynolds was sent with his company to clean them up. It was late in October 1877 before the company reached its destination and camped on the North Llano River below the mouth of Bear Creek. As soon as our horses had rested and camp was fully established for the winter we began scouting. Several men wanted on minor charges were captured. We then raided Luke Stone's ranch, which was about 10 miles from our camp, and captured Del Dublin. He was fearfully angry when he found escape impossible. He tore his shirt bosom open and dared the Rangers to shoot him. While he was being disarmed, his elder brother, Dick, rode out of the brush and came within firing range of the ranch before he discovered the presence of the Rangers. He turned his horse quickly and made his escape, though the Rangers pursued him some distance. When Dick learned that the Bannister boys and myself were with Lieutenant Reynolds's company and hot on his trail, he declared he would whip us with a quilt, as a man would a dog if he ever came upon us, for he remembered us as beardless boys with the Joe Franks cow outfit. However, despite his threat, he never attempted to make it good, but took very good care to keep out of our way until the fatal January 18, 1878. There was no jail in Kimball County, so with a detachment of Rangers, I took Del Dublin and our other prisoners to Llano County lockup. Shortly afterward, Reynolds selected Sergeant McGee, Tom Gillespie, Dick Harrison, and Tim McCarthy and made a scout into Menard County. He also had with him his black individual cook, George, to drive his light wagon. On the return toward Bear Creek, the scout camped for the night at Fort McCavitt. At that time, each frontier post had its Chihuahua or scab town, a little settlement with gambling halls, saloons, etc., to catch the soldiers' dollars. At Fort McCavitt were many discharged soldiers, some of them black individuals from the 10th Cavalry. These blacks had associated with white gamblers and lewd women until they thought themselves the equals of white men and became mean and overbearing. On this particular night, these black individual ex-soldiers gave a dance in Scabtown, and our black individual, George, wanted to go. He was a light mulatto, almost white, but well thought of by all the boys in the company. He obtained Lieutenant Reynolds' permission to attend the dance and borrowed Tim McCarthy's pistol to carry it. When George arrived at the dance hall, the ex-soldiers did not like his appearance, as he was allied with the Rangers, whom they despised. They jumped on George, took his pistol, and kicked him out of the place. The boys were all in bed when George returned and told McCarthy that the black individuals at the dance hall had taken his pistol from him. Lieutenant Reynolds was sleeping nearby and heard what George said. He raised up on his elbow and ordered Sergeant McGee to go with McCarthy and George and get the pistol. The black individuals saw McGee coming and, closing the door, defied him to enter the dance hall. McGee was cool and careful. He advised the black individuals to return the pistol, but they refused, saying they would kill the first white-livered S.O.B. that attempted to enter the house. The sergeant then stationed himself at the front door, ordered McCarthy to guard the back entrance of the place, and sent George for the lieutenant. Reynolds hurried to the scene, taking with him Tom Gillespie and Dick Harrison. The lieutenant knocked on the door and told the blacks he was the commander of the Rangers and demanded their surrender. They replied with an oath that they would not do so. Reynolds then ordered the house cleared of women and gave the black individuals just 5 minutes in which to surrender. Up to this time the women had been quiet, but they now began to scream. This probably demoralized the black individual men. One of them poked McCarthy's pistol, muzzle foremost, out of a window. "Here, come get your D&, pistol," he said. McCarthy, a new man in the service, stepped up and grasped it. The instant the black individual felt the touch of McCarthy's hand on the weapon, he pulled the trigger. The ball pierced McCarthy's body just above the heart, giving him a mortal wound. At the crack of the pistol, the Rangers opened fire through the doors and windows on the black individuals within the house. Reynolds and his men then charged the place, and when the smoke of battle cleared, they found 4 dead black individual men and a little black individual girl that had been killed by accident. Only one black escaped. He was hidden under a bed, and as the Rangers came in, made a dash to safety under cover of darkness. McCarthy died the following day and was buried near Old Fort McCavitt. Black individual George fought like a tiger and won the boys' praise. A few days afterward, the sheriff of Tom Green County, following the trail of a bunch of stolen cattle from San Angelo, came into our camp. Lieutenant Reynolds sent Sergeant Neville and a scout of rangers with the sheriff. The trail led over to the South Llano, where the cattle were recovered. While scouting around the herd, Sergeant Neville discovered a man riding down the trail toward him. He and his men secreted themselves and awaited the stranger's approach. It was getting quite dark, and when the newcomer had ridden almost over the concealed rangers without noticing their presence, they rose up, presented their guns, and ordered him to halt. "Yes, like hell!" he exclaimed, and turning his horse, dived into a cedar brake. A shower of bullets followed, but failed to strike the fugitive. This was the notorious Dick Dublin, with a $700 reward on his head. Sergeant Neville returned to camp with about 50 heads of burnt cattle, but let the most notorious criminal in the county escape. Lieutenant Reynolds was disappointed at this and said he did not understand how 4 crack rangers could let a man ride right over them and then get away. He declared his black individual cook could have killed Dublin had he been in their place. This mortified the boys a great deal. The latter part of December 1877, Lieutenant Reynolds sent a scout out on Little Saline, Menard County. On Christmas Day, this detail had a running fight with 4 men. John Collins, the man who stole a yoke of oxen at Fredericksburg and drove them up to within 2 miles of our camp, was captured, as was also John Gray, wanted for murder in one of the eastern counties. Jim Pope Mason, charged with the murder of Ranny Moore, was in this skirmish, but escaped. One cold morning about the middle of January, Corporal Gillett, with Privates John and Will Bannister, Tom Gillespie, Dave Ligon, and Ben Carter, was ordered on a 5-days scout. We saddled our horses and packed 2 mules. When all was ready, I walked over to Lieutenant Reynolds. He was sitting on a camp stool before his tent and seemed in a brown study. I saluted and asked for orders. "Well, Corporal," he said after a moment's hesitation, "it is a scout after Dick Dublin again. That man seems to be a regular Jonah to this company. He lives only 10 miles from here, and I have been awfully disappointed at not being able to effect his capture. It is a reflection on all of Company E. There is one thing sure: if I can't capture him, I will make life miserable for him. I will keep a scout in the field after him constantly." I then asked if he had any instructions as to the route I should travel. "No, no," he replied. "I rely too much on your judgment to hamper you with orders. After you are once out of sight of camp, you know these mountains and trails better than I do. Just go and do your best. If you come in contact with him, don't let him get away." After riding a half-mile from camp, the boys began inquiring where we were going and who we were after. I told them Dick Dublin. We quit the road and traveled south from our camp over to the head of Pack Saddle Creek. Here we turned down the creek and rounded up the Potter Ranch, but no one was at home, so we passed on into the Cedar Brake without having been seen. On the extreme headwaters of South Llano River, some cattlemen had built a large stock pen and were using it to confine wild cattle. This was far out beyond any settlement and probably 50 or 60 miles from our camp. I thought it possible that Dick Dublin might be hanging around the place, so we traveled through the woods most of the way to it. Here I found that the cattlemen had moved. The scout had now been out for 2 days, so we began our return journey. We traveled probably 25 miles on the 3rd day. On the 4th day, I timed myself to reach the Potter Ranch at night. Old Man Potter, a friend and neighbor of Dublin's, lived here with 2 grown sons. It was known that Dublin frequented the place, and I hoped to catch him here unawares. About sundown, we were within a mile of the ranch. Here we unsaddled our horses and prepared to round up the house. If we met with no success, we were to camp there for the night. I left John Bannister and Ligon to guard camp while Gillespie, Will Bannister, and Ben Carter, with myself, approached the ranch on foot. If I found no one there, I intended to return to our camp unseen and round up the ranch again the following morning. We had not traveled far before we discovered a lone man riding slowly down the trail to the Potter Ranch. We remained hidden and were able to approach within 50 yards of the house without being seen. We now halted in the bed of a creek for a short consultation. The one-room cabin had only a single door, and before it was a small wagon. The Potters cooked out of doors between the house and the wagon. We could see a horse tied to the south side of the vehicle, but could not see the campfire for the wagon and the horse. To our right, and about 25 steps away, Old Man Potter and one of his sons were unloading some hogs from a wagon into a pen. We knew the moment we left the creek bed we would be in full view of the Potters and the ranch house. We decided then that we would advance on the house as fast as we could run and be in a good position to capture the man who had ridden into the camp. We rose from the creek running. Old Man Potter discovered us as we came into view and yelled, "Run, Dick, run! Here comes the Rangers." We then knew the man we wanted was at the camp. We were so close to Dublin that he had no time to mount his horse or get his gun, so he made a run for the brush. I was within 25 yards of him when he came from behind the wagon, running as fast as a big man could. I ordered him to halt and surrender, but he had heard that call too many times and kept going. Holding my Winchester carbine in my right hand, I fired a shot directly at him as I ran. In a moment he was out of sight. I hurried to the place where he was last seen and spied him running up a little ravine. I stopped, drew a bead on him, and again ordered him to halt. As he ran, Dublin threw his hand back under his coat as though he were attempting to draw a pistol. I fired. My bullet struck the fugitive in the small of the back, just over the right hip bone, and passed out near his right collarbone. It killed him instantly. He was bending over as he ran, and this caused the unusual course of my ball. The boys, whom I had outrun, now joined me, and Carter fired 2 shots at Dublin after he was down. I ordered him to desist, as the man was dead. I examined the body to make sure it was Dublin, for I knew him intimately, as I had cow-hunted with him before I became a ranger. We found him unarmed, but he had a belt of cartridges around his waist. He was so completely surprised by our sudden appearance, he could do nothing but run. The $700 reward on him could never be collected, as it was offered for his arrest and conviction. Dublin's brothers, Roll and Dell, swore vengeance against myself and the Bannister boys, but nothing ever came of the oath. In the month of February 1878, Lieutenant Reynolds started to Austin with 5 prisoners he had captured in Kimball and Menard counties. They were chained together in pairs. John Stevens, the odd man, was shackled by himself. As guard for these prisoners, Reynolds had detailed Will and John Bannister, Dave Ligon, Ben Carter, Dick Ware, and myself. On the Junction City and Mason Road, some 10 miles east of our camp, was the small ranch of Stark Reynolds, a fugitive from justice, charged with horse stealing and assault to kill. Company E had scouted for him in Kimball County and had rounded up his ranch many times. We knew he was in the county, but he always managed to escape us. As we passed this ranch, Lieutenant Reynolds, Privates Ware, Carter, Ligon, and myself were marching in front, with a 4-mule wagon following us, in which were the chained prisoners. Behind it came the Bannisters, who were on guard that day and detailed to keep a constant watch on the captive outlaws. We passed the Starka Reynolds home about 10 o'clock in the morning, and Lieutenant Reynolds remarked that it was hardly worthwhile to round up the house, as he had done so many times in the past without result, but that he would surely like to capture the fellow. We hadn't ridden more than half a mile beyond the ranch when we came face to face with Stark himself. He was a small man, riding an exceedingly good brown pony. We were about 400 yards apart and discovered each other at the same instant. The outlaw was carrying a small sack of flour in front of him. He immediately threw this down, turned his horse quickly, and made a lightning dash for the Llano Bottoms, some 3 miles away. At that point, the Junction City and Mason Road winds along a range of high mountains, with the country sloping downward to the Llano River. This grade was studded with scrubby live oak and mesquite brush, not thick enough to hide a man, but sufficiently dense to retard his flight through it. We gave chase at once, and for 1.5 miles it was the fastest race I ever saw the Rangers run. We were closely bunched the entire distance, with Lieutenant Reynolds, he was riding a fast racehorse, always slightly in the lead. He finally got close enough to the fugitive to demand his surrender. Stark only waved his gun defiantly and redoubled his speed. Lieutenant Reynolds then drew his 6-shooter and began firing at the outlaw. After emptying his pistol, he began using his Winchester. The Llano bottoms were now looming right up in front of us. The race had been fast enough to run every horse into a big limber. Carter, Ware, and Ligon dropped out of the race. Up to this time I had contented myself by trying to keep up with Lieutenant Reynolds, for it is always easier to follow a man through the brush than to run in the lead. I had a good grip on my bridle reins and was trying to steady my pony as best I could. I now saw that the outlaw was beginning to gain on us. I ran up beside the lieutenant and said, "He is getting away from us. Must I go after him?" Lieutenant Reynolds turned and looked at me with the wildest look on his face that I ever saw. His hat was gone, his face was badly scratched by the brush with the blood running down over his white shirt bosom. "Yes, G.D.N. him! Stop, or kill him!" I changed the bridle reins to my left hand, drew my gun with my right, and digging my spurs deep into my pony's side, I was out of sight of the lieutenant in 300 yards. The fugitive saw that I was alone and that I was going to overhaul him. He suddenly brought his pony to a standstill, jumped down, took shelter behind the animal, and drew a bead on me with his gun. "And you? Stop or I'll kill you!" he cried. I tried to obey his order, but my pony was running down the hill and ran straight at him for 25 yards before I could stop. I jumped down from my horse and made ready to fight, but Stark broke for a thicket on foot. As soon as he ran out from behind his pony, I fired at him. The bullet must have come rather close to him, for he turned quickly and took shelter behind his mount again. As he peeped over his saddle at me, I attempted to draw a bead on his head, but I was tired, nervous, and unsteady. Before I could shoot Dave, Ligon galloped right up to the outlaw, ordered him to surrender, and drop his gun, which Stark did at once. The boys had heard me shoot, and in 5 minutes were all upon the scene. The captive was searched and ordered to remount his pony. With one of the boys leading Stark's mount, we started back to the wagon, nearly 3 miles away. As soon as the outlaw was a prisoner and knew he would not be harmed, no matter what he said, he began a tirade against the Rangers. He declared the whole battalion was a set of D murderers, especially Company E, and said it was curbstone talk in Menard, Mason, and Kimball counties that Lieutenant Reynolds' men would kill a man and then yell for him to throw up his hands. He kept up this running talk until he exhausted Lieutenant Reynolds' patience. The latter then ordered Stark to shut up and declared the speaker was a D liar, for Company E never killed a man without first giving him a chance to surrender. Lieutenant Reynolds then said that with the last old briar breaker captured, he had accomplished the task set for him and was now ready to go elsewhere. As we rode along, one of the boys remarked that my pony was limping badly. "I wish his leg would come right off up to his shoulder," declared Stark in disgust. "If it hadn't been for him, I would have made it to the bottom and escaped." On approaching the wagon, the prisoner Stevens, a man of some intelligence and humor, stood up and called out to Stark, "By G, old man, they got you. They rode too many corn-fed horses and carried too many guns for you. I don't know who you are, but I'm sorry for you. While they were chasing you, I got down on my knees here in this wagon, and with my face turned up to the skies, I prayed to the Almighty God that you might get away." Stark was chained to this good-natured liar, and now, for the first time, our prisoner seemed to realize his condition. He asked Lieutenant Reynolds to send word to his family that he had been captured. The lieutenant thereupon sent one of the boys to Stark's home to tell Mrs. Reynolds that the Rangers would camp on Red Creek for dinner, and if she wished to see her husband, we would be there probably 2 hours. Presently, Stark's old gray-haired father came to our midday camp. When he saw his son chained, he burst out crying, saying, "My son, it is not my fault that you are in this condition. I did my best to give you good advice and tried to raise you right." After dinner, we resumed our march toward Austin. Stark Reynolds was finally turned over to the sheriff of Tarrant County. He was admitted to bail and given bond, but before he came to trial, he was waylaid and killed, supposedly by relatives of the man he had previously attempted to murder. Early in the spring of 1878, A ranchman living 5 miles above our camp saw a bunch of Indians on Bear Creek, Kimball County, and at once reported to Lieutenant Reynolds. The Native Americans had been seen late in the evening, and by the time a scout could be started after them, it was almost night. The lieutenant, however, followed the trail until it entered a cedar break. It was then too dark to work farther, so the scout returned to camp to make arrangements to resume the trail the following morning. On the march back to camp, the Rangers picked up a paint pony with an arrow sticking in its hip. The Indians had probably tried to catch the horse, and failing to do so, had shot it, as was their custom. Just after dark, a runner from Junction City came in and reported a bunch of Native Americans had been seen near the town stealing horses. It was a beautiful moonlight night, and a close watch was kept on our horses. Just at midnight, John Bannister, an alert man on guard, noticed that one of our pack mules hitched at the end of our picket line was pulling back on its rope and looking over a brush fence that enclosed the camp. With Winchester in hand, Bannister passed through a gate, walked slowly down the fence, and into some small underbrush near the mule. Suddenly a man rose to his feet and fired on Bannister at a distance of not more than 10 steps, then broke and ran. Bannister at once opened fire on the Indian. The very first report of a gun brought every man in camp out of his bed. We could see the flashes of Bannister's gun and went to his aid in our night clothes and barefooted. I ran down by the picket line of horses and jumped the fence where the mule had seen the Native American. By moonlight I could glimpse the Indian running down the riverbank. I shot at him 9 times as he ran, but without effect. Some 200 yards below our camp was a ford on the Llano, and the fugitive was making for it. Just as soon as the Indian reached the crossing and plunged into the river, 8 or 9 of the Rangers that had followed Bannister on the high ground were in a position to shell the swimmer as he crossed. There were probably 100 shots fired at him, but he finally disappeared in the brush on the south side of the river. Investigation of the place where he crossed showed the timber cut all to pieces, but, strange to say, not a shot hit the Indian as far as we ever knew. We found a blanket where the savage had risen and shot at Bannister, and measuring the ground, found that the Ranger was just 12 short steps from the Indian when fired upon by the Native American. It was a miracle that Bannister was not killed. The bullet, a .45 caliber, buried itself in some sacks of corn in a tent just back of him. The next morning we found where 10 or 12 Indians had waited under some large pecan trees while this scout slipped up to our camp to investigate and steal a horse. The trees were about 400 yards from camp and on the opposite side of the river. Some of the Rangers jokingly said those old braves must have thought this lone one stirred up hell at the Ranger camp. On account of the range of cattle and horses along the Llano River, Lieutenant Reynolds lost some 8 or 10 hours the next morning before picking up the Indian trail. This gave the Native Americans 10 or 12 hours to start, as they were at our camp just at midnight. The trail passed out west between North and South Llano rivers and followed a rough mountain country that made pursuit difficult and slow. We followed the savages for 5 or 6 days and finally abandoned the trail near the head of Devil's River after a heavy rain. While we had been active in rounding up the numerous outlaws and cattle thieves that infested Kimball County, we had not been able to clean up the mystery of the peg-leg stage robbers, which had long baffled the best detectives, sheriffs, and rangers. Peg Leg was a small stage station on the San Saba in the midst of a rough and very mountainous country. Here the stage was repeatedly held up, and as repeatedly the robbers escaped. The scene of the holdup was many times examined, and parties made determined efforts to trail the bandits, but always without success, for the trail was quickly lost in the rough mountains. One of the features that proved particularly puzzling was the constant recurrence of an exceedingly small footprint at each robbery. These marks were so very small, they convinced many observers that a woman from Fort McCavett, or Fort Concho, was operating with the bandit gang. Naturally, the Rangers were anxious to round up this group of outlaws and put a stop to their depredations. In May 1878, Sergeant Neville made a scout up on the South Llano and captured Bill Allison, a son-in-law of old Jimmy Dublin, father of the bandit, Dick Dublin. Allison was wanted on several charges of cattle theft and was taken to Austin for safekeeping. After remaining in the Travis County Jail for nearly a year without being able to give bond, Allison became discouraged. He believed his brothers-in-law, the Dublins, were not aiding him to get bond, and became bitter and resentful toward them. This antagonism finally led to the unveiling of the Peg Leg mystery. In the spring of 1879, Dick Ware and myself took some prisoners to the Austin jail. Bill Allison saw us and called out to me. He and I had been cowboys together long before I became a ranger. "Jim," said Allison, "you know I have been cooped up here in this jail for nearly a year. People who ought to be my friends have evidently abandoned me, and I am not going to stand it any longer. I can put the Peg Leg stage robbers behind the bars, and I am going to do it." Ware, who was something of a diplomat, said, "Hold on, Bill. If you have anything to confess, we will get an order from the sheriff to take you to see General Jones so you can talk to him." The general at once wrote a note to Dennis Corwin, sheriff of Travis County, and asked that he let Allison accompany us to his office. The sheriff turned his prisoner over to us, and we took him to General Jones, who had a private interview with him for over an hour. What Allison confessed we did not know, but we returned him to the jail. General Jones moved quickly, for the very next day a scout of Rangers from Company E was sent back to Kimball County. I was just preparing to go west to El Paso with Colonel Baylor, so I missed this last and most important scout back into Kimball County. However, this final expedition was so successful, I cannot omit it from a history of the Rangers. Arriving at Kimball County, the Company E detail arrested Roll and Del Dublin, Mac Potter, and Rube Boyce. In the running fight that resulted in their capture, Roll received a bad wound in the hip. The two Dublin brothers and Mac Potter, when arraigned in federal court, plead guilty to stage robbery and were sentenced to 15 years at hard labor. During their trial, the mystery of the Peg Leg robberies was finally cleared up. The Dublin boys were the guiding spirits in the holdups and worked with great cleverness. Old man Jimmy Dublin's ranch on the South Llano was their headquarters. From the ranch to Peg Leg Station on the San Saba was not more than 60 miles across a rough, mountainous country. As there were no wire fences in those days, the robbers would ride over to the station, rob the stage, and in one night's ride regain their home. Traveling at night, they were never observed. Dick Dublin, whose death while resisting capture has already been described, was the leader of the bandit gang. Even the mystery of the tiny footprints was disclosed. They were made by Mac Potter, who had an unusually small foot for a man. While Rube Boyce was confined in the Travis County Jail, he made one of the most sensational jail escapes in the criminal annals of Texas. Mrs. Boyce called at the prison with a suit of clean underclothes for her husband. The basket in which she carried them was examined, and she was admitted into the cell of her husband. However, she had hidden a big .45 Colt's revolver about her person and smuggled it in. Rube changed his underwear, put the soiled garments in the basket, and hid the pistol under them. At the end of her visit, Mrs. Boyce started out, and Rube accompanied her down the corridor to the door. Mr. Albert Nichols, the jailer, opened the door with his left hand to let the woman pass out, at the same time holding his pistol in his right hand. As the door swung open, Rube reached into the basket he was carrying for his wife, whipped out the hidden pistol, thrust it into the jailer's face, and ordered him to drop his. "45" and step within the jail. Realizing that a second's hesitation would mean his death, Nichols complied and was locked in by the outlaw. Boyce then ran out of the backyard of the jail, mounted a pony that had been hitched there for him, and galloped out of Austin, firing his pistol as he ran. He made a complete getaway. 3 or 4 years later, he was arrested at Socorro, New Mexico, and returned to Austin. At his trial for participation in the Peg Leg stage robberies, he was acquitted, and perhaps justly so, for Bill Allison declared to me that Dick Dublin with his brothers Del and Roll and Mac Potter were the real robbers. The arrest and conviction of the Dublins, together with the other men Lieutenant Reynolds had captured or killed, completely cleaned out the stage robbers, cattle and horse thieves and murderers that had made Kimball County their rendezvous. Today, Kimball County is one of the most prosperous and picturesque counties in the state. Its citizens are law-abiding and energetic. Junction City, the county seat, is a splendid little city of probably 2,500 inhabitants. 40 years ago, at the time of which I write, there were no courthouses in Kimball County. The first district courts were held under the spreading boughs of a large oak tree. The rangers, of which I was frequently one, guarded the prisoners under another tree at a convenient distance from the judge and his attendants. Late in the spring or early summer of 1878, at a session of the County Court of San Saba County, Billy Brown was being prosecuted by County Attorney Brooks for a violation of the prohibition laws. Brown took offense at a remark of the prosecuting attorney and attempted to draw his six-shooter on him. T.J.T. Kendall, a law partner of Brooks, saw Brown's move and quickly whipping out his own pistol, he killed Brown in the courtroom. Then, fearing a mob if captured, Kendall fortified himself in a second story of the courthouse and refused to surrender. He held the whole town at bay while his wife administered to his wants. Meantime, he sent a hurry call to the nearest rangers, asking for protection against mob violence. Captain Arrington received the message and sent a detachment from Coleman to San Saba to preserve order. General Jones was notified and ordered Lieutenant Reynolds at Junction City to march to San Saba with his company, take charge of Kendall, and relieve Captain Arrington's men. It was probably 2 weeks after the killing before Company E reached San Saba, but Mr. Kendall was still holding fort in the upper story of the courthouse. On the arrival of Reynolds' company, Kendall asked the court for a preliminary examination. When court convened, the prisoner waived examination and asked for transference to the Travis County Jail at Austin. The court, realizing the feeling against Kendall, ordered his removal thither. When the time came for Kendall's removal, a hack was driven up to the courthouse door, where a great crowd had assembled to see the prisoner. Jim Brown, sheriff of Lee County, Texas, and brother of Bill Brown, heavily armed, had taken his station within 10 feet of the prison door. Just before Mr. Kendall descended the courthouse steps, Lieutenant Reynolds ordered the crowd to fall back 50 feet from the hack. The people immediately obeyed, with the exception of Jim Brown, who sat perfectly still on his horse. The lieutenant looked at Brown for a minute, then turned to his rangers and ordered them to draw their guns and move everyone 50 yards from the courthouse. Like a flash, every ranger drew his gun, dismounted, and waved the crowd back. Brown turned to Reynolds and said, "I am going to Austin with you. If you do, you will go in irons. Move back." Brown, who had killed several men, slowly turned his horse and rode away. He did not know the man with whom he was dealing. Lawyer Kendall was thereupon carried to Austin without incident. When we reached Austin, Jim Brown met Lieutenant Reynolds on the street and apologized for the way he had acted at San Saba. He said he fully intended to kill Kendall as he approached the hack, but the presence of so many rangers caused him to change his mind. Lieutenant Reynolds declared he was anticipating just such a move and had instructed his men to shoot Brown into doll rags at his first move. Soon after this, Lieutenant Reynolds moved Company E down on the San Saba in a beautiful pecan grove, an ideal summer camp about 2 miles from the town of San Saba. From this point, we scouted all over Llano, Lampasas, Burnett, and San Saba counties in our favorite pursuit of rounding up bad men. It was from this camp that we made our sensational ride to Round Rock after Sam Bass, the notorious train robber. Chapter 9. Sam Bass and his train robber gang. Table of contents. Sam Bass, the noted train robber, was born in Indiana, July 21, 1851. He came to Texas while quite a youth and worked for Sheriff Everhart of Denton County until he reached manhood. While still an exemplary and honest young man, Bass came into possession of a small race pony, a little sorrel mare. On Saturday evenings, when most of the neighborhood boys met in Denton, Bass raced his pony with much success. Mr. Everhart soon noticed that Sam was beginning to neglect his work because of his pony, and knowing only too well what this would lead to, he advised Sam to sell his mare. Bass hesitated, for he loved the animal. Finally, matters came to such a point that Mr. Everhart told Sam he would have to get rid of the horse or give up his job. Thereupon, Bass promptly quit, and this was probably the turning point in his life. Bass left Denton County in the spring of 1877 and traveled to San Antonio. Here, many cattlemen were gathered to arrange for the spring cattle drive to the north. Joel Collins, who was planning to drive a herd from Uvalde County to Deadwood, Dakota, hired Bass as a cowboy. After 6 months on the trail, the herd reached Deadwood and was sold, and all the cowboys paid off by Mr. Collins. At that period, Deadwood was a great, wide-open mining town. Adventurers, gamblers, mining, and cattlemen all mingled together. Though Joel Collins had bought his cattle on credit and owed the greater part of the money he had received for them to his friends in Texas, he gambled away all the money he had received for the herd. When he sobered up and realized all his money was gone, he did not have the moral courage to face his friends and creditors at home. He became desperate, and with a band of his cowboys held up and robbed several stagecoaches in the Black Hills. These robberies brought Collins very little booty, but they started Sam Bass on his criminal career. In the fall of 1877, Collins, accompanied by Bass, Jack Davis, Jim Berry, Bill Heffridge, and John Underwood, better known as Old Dad, left Deadwood and drifted down to Ogallala, Nebraska. Here he conceived, planned, and carried into execution one of the boldest train robberies that ever occurred in the United States up to that time. When all was ready, these 6 men, heavily armed and masked, held up the Union Pacific train at Big Springs, a small station a few miles beyond Ogallala. The bandits entered the express car and ordered the messenger to open the safe. The latter explained that the through safe had a time lock and could only be opened at the end of the route. One of the robbers then began to beat the messenger over the head with a 6-shooter, declaring he would kill him if the safe were not opened. Bass, always of a kindly nature, pleaded with the man to desist, declaring he believed the messenger was telling the truth. Just as the robbers were preparing to leave the car without a cent, one of them noticed 3 stout little boxes piled near the big safe. The curious bandit seized a coal pick and knocked off the lid of the top box. To his great joy and delight, he exhibited $20,000 in a shining gold coin. The 3 boxes each held a similar amount, all in 20 gold pieces of the mintage of 1877. After looting these boxes, the robbers went through the train and, in a systematic manner, robbed the passengers of about $5,000. By daylight, the bandits had hidden their booty and returned to Ogallala. They hung around town several days while railroad officials, United States Marshals, and sheriff's parties were scouring the country for the train robbers. While in Ogallala, before and after the robbery, Collins and his men frequented a large general merchandise store. In this store was a clerk who had once been an express messenger on the Union Pacific and who was well acquainted with the officials of that company. I have forgotten his name, but I will call him Moore for the sake of clearness in my narrative. Of course, the great train robbery was the talk of the town. Moore conversed with Collins and his gang about the holdup, and the bandits declared they would help hunt the robbers if there was enough money in it. Moore's suspicions were aroused, and he became convinced that Collins and his band were the real hold-up men. However, he said nothing to anyone about this belief, but carefully watched the men. Finally, Collins came to the store, and after buying clothing and provisions, told Mr. Moore that he and his companions were going back to Texas and would be up the trail the following spring with another herd of cattle. When Collins had gone on a day's travel, Mr. Moore hired a horse and followed him. He soon found the route the suspects were traveling, and on the second day, Moore came upon them suddenly while they were stopping at a roadside farmhouse to have some bread cooked. Moore passed by without being noticed and secreted himself near the highway. In a short time, Collins and his men passed on, and Moore trailed them until they went into camp. When it was dark, the amateur detective crept up to the bandits, but they had gone to sleep, and he learned nothing. The next day, Moore resumed the trail. He watched the gang make their camp for the night, and again crept up to within a few yards of his suspects. The bandits had built a big fire and were laughing and talking. Soon they spread out a blanket, and to Moore's great astonishment, brought out some money bags and emptied upon the blanket $60,000 in gold. From his concealed position, the trailer heard the robbers discuss the holdup. They declared they did not believe anyone had recognized or suspected them, and decided it was now best for them to divide the money, separate in pairs, and go their way. The coin was stacked in 6 piles, and each man received $10,000 in 20 gold pieces. It was further decided that Collins and Bill Heffridge would travel back to San Antonio, Texas, together. Sam Bass and Jack Davis were to go to Denton County, Texas, while Jim Barry and Old Dad were to return to the Barry home in Mexico, Missouri. As soon as Mr. Moore had seen the money and heard the robbers' plans, he slipped back to his horse, mounted, and rode day and night to reach Ogallala. He notified the railroad officials of what he had seen, gave the names and descriptions of the bandits and their destinations. This information was broadcast over southern Nebraska, Kansas, Indian Territory, and Texas. In the fugitive list sent to each of the companies of the Frontier Battalion of Rangers, Sam Bass was thus described: 25 to 26 years old, 5 feet 7 inches high, black hair, dark brown eyes, brown mustache, large white teeth, shows them when talking, has very little to say. A few days after the separation of the robbers, Joel Collins and Bill Heffridge rode into a small place in Kansas called Buffalo Station. They led a pack pony. Dismounting from their tired horses and leaving them standing in the shade of the store building, the 2 men entered the store and made several purchases. The railroad agent at the place noticed the strangers riding up. He had, of course, been advised to be on the lookout for the train robbers. He entered the store and in a little while engaged Collins in conversation. While talking, the robber pulled his handkerchief out of his coat pocket and exposed a letter with his name thereon. The agent was a shrewd man. He asked Collins if he had not driven a herd of cattle up the trail in the spring. Collins declared he had, and finally, in answer to a direct question, admitted that his name was Joel Collins. 500 or 600 yards from Buffalo Station, a lieutenant of the United States Army had camped with a troop of 10 men that was scouting for the train robbers. As soon as Collins and Heffridge remounted and resumed their way, the agent ran quickly to the soldiers' camp, pointed out the bandits to the lieutenant, and declared, "There go 2 of the Union Pacific train robbers." The Army officer mounted his men and pursued Collins and Heffridge. When he overtook the 2 men, he told them their descriptions tallied with those of some train robbers that he was scouting for, and declared they would have to go back to the station and be identified. Collins laughed at the idea, and declared that he and his companion were cattlemen returning to their homes in Texas. They reluctantly turned and started back with the soldiers. After riding a few hundred yards, the 2 robbers held a whispered conversation. Suddenly the 2 pulled their pistols and attempted to stand off the lieutenant and his troop. The desperadoes were promptly shot and killed. On examining their packs, the soldiers found tied up in the legs of a pair of overalls $20,000 in gold, 1877 mintage. Not a dollar of the stolen money had been used, and there was no doubt about the identity of the men. Not long after the divide up in Nebraska, Jim Barry appeared at his home in Mexico, Missouri. At once he deposited quite a lot of money in the local bank and exchanged $3,000 in gold for currency, explaining his possession of the gold by saying he had sold a mine in the Black Hills. In 3 or 4 days, the sheriff of the county learned of Barry's deposits and called at the bank to see the new depositor's gold. His suspicion became a certainty when he found that Barry had deposited 20 gold pieces in 1877. At night, the sheriff with a posse rounded up Barry's house, but the suspect was not there. The home was well provisioned, and the posse found many articles of newly purchased clothing. Just after daylight, while searching about the place, the sheriff heard a horse whinny in some timber nearby. Upon investigating this, he suddenly came upon Jim Barry sitting on a pallet. Barry discovered the officer at about the same time and attempted to escape by running. He was fired upon, one bullet striking him in the knee and badly shattering it. He was taken to his home and given the best of medical attention, but gangrene set in and he died in a few days. Most of his $10,000 was recovered. Old Dad evidently quit Barry somewhere en route, for he made good his escape with his ill-gotten gain and was never apprehended. Sam Bass and Jack Davis, after the separation in Nebraska, sold their ponies, bought a light spring wagon, and a pair of workhorses. They placed their gold pieces in the bottom of the wagon, threw their bedding and clothes over it, and in this disguise traveled through Kansas and the Indian Territory to Denton County, Texas. During their trip through the territory, base afterward said he camped within 100 yards of a detachment of cavalry. After supper, he and Davis visited the soldiers' camp and chatted with them until bedtime. The soldiers said they were on the lookout for some train robbers that had held up the Union Pacific in Nebraska, never dreaming for a moment that they were conversing with two of them. The men also mentioned that two of the robbers had been reported killed in Kansas. This rumor put Bass and Davis on their guard, and on reaching Denton County, they hid in the elm bottoms until Bass could interview some of his friends. Upon meeting them, he learned that the names and descriptions of every one of the Union Pacific train robbers were in the possession of the law officers, that Collins, Heffridge, and Barry had been killed, and that every sheriff in North Texas was on the watch for Davis and himself. Davis at once begged Bass to go with him to South America, but Bass refused, so Davis bade Sam goodbye and set out alone. He was never captured. On his deathbed, Bass declared he had once received a letter from Jack Davis written from New Orleans, asking Bass to come there and go into the business of buying hides. Bass had left Denton County early in the spring as an honest, sincere, and clean young man. By falling with evil associates, he had become, within a few months, one of the most daring outlaws and train robbers of his time. Before he had committed any crime in the state, the officers of North Texas made repeated efforts to capture him for the big reward offered by the Union Pacific and the Express Company. But, owing to the nature of the country around Denton and the friends Bass had as long as his gold lasted, met with no success. Bass's money soon attracted several desperate and daring men to him. Henry Underwood, Arkansas Johnson, Jim Murphy, Frank Jackson, Pipes Herndon, and Collins, the last one a cousin of Joel Collins, and 2 or 3 others joined him in the elm bottoms. Naturally, Bass was selected as leader of the gang. It was not long before the outlaw chief planned and executed his first train robbery in Texas. That at Eagle Ford, a small station on the TP Railroad a few miles out of Dallas. In quick succession, the bandits held up 2 or 3 other trains, the last, I believe, being at Mesquite Station, 10 or 12 miles east of Dallas. From this robbery, they secured about $3,000. They met with opposition here, for the conductor, though armed with only a small pistol, fought the robbers to a fare-you-well and slightly wounded one of them. The whole state was now aroused by the repeated train holdups. General Jones hurried to Dallas and Denton to look over the situation, and, strange to say, he arranged to organize a company of Rangers at Dallas. Captain June Peak, a very able officer, was given the command. No matter how brave a company of recruits, it takes time and training to get results from them, and when this raw company was thrown into the field against Bass and his gang, the bandit leader played with it like a child playing with toys. Counting the 30 Rangers and the different sheriff's parties, there were probably 100 men in pursuit of the Bass gang. Sam played hide-and-seek with them all, and it is said never ranged any farther west than Stevens County or farther north than Wise. He was generally in Dallas, Denton, or Tarrant counties. He would frequently visit Fort Worth or Dallas at night, ride up with his men to some outside saloon, get drinks all around, and then vamoose. Finally, in a fight at Salt Creek, Wise County, Captain June Peak and his Rangers killed Arkansas Johnson, Bass's most trusted lieutenant. Either just before or soon after this battle, the Rangers captured Pipes Herndon and Jim Murphy and drove Bass and his 2 remaining companions out of North Texas. At that time, the state had on the frontier of Texas 6 companies of veteran Rangers. They were finely mounted, highly equipped, and were the best mounted police in the world. Any company on the line could have been marched to Denton in 10 days, yet they were never moved 1 mile in that direction. Any one of those highly trained commands could have broken up the Sam Bass gang in half the time it took a command of new men. After the fight on Salt Creek, only Sam Bass, C-Bay Barnes, and Frank Jackson were left of the once formidable gang. These men had gained nothing from their 4 train robberies in North Texas and were so hard-pressed by the officers of the law on all sides that Bass reluctantly decided to leave the country and try to make his way to Old Mexico. Through some pretended friends of Bass, General Jones learned of the contemplated move. He, with Captain Peake and other officers, approached Jim Murphy, one of Bass's gang captured about the time of the Salt Creek fight, who was awaiting trial by the federal authorities for train robbery, and promised they would secure his release if he would betray Bass. Murphy hesitated and said his former chief had been kind to his family, had given them money and provisions, and that it would be ungrateful to betray his friend. The general declared he understood Murphy's position fully, but Bass was an outlaw, a pest to the country who was preparing to leave the state, and so could no longer help him. General Jones warned Murphy that the evidence against him was overwhelming and was certain to send him to the federal prison, probably for life, and exhorted him to remember his wife and his children. Murphy finally yielded and agreed to betray Bass and his gang at the first opportunity. According to the plan agreed upon, Murphy was to give bond, and when the federal court convened at Tyler, Texas, a few weeks later, he was not to show up. It would then be published all over the country that Murphy had skipped bond and rejoined Bass. This was carried out to the letter. Murphy joined Bass in the elm bottoms of Denton County and agreed to rob a train or bank and get out of the country. Some of Bass's friends, suspicious of Murphy's bondsman, wrote to Sam that Murphy was playing a double game and advised him to kill the traitor at once. Bass immediately confronted Murphy with these reports and reminded him how freely he had handed out his gold to Murphy's family. Bass declared he had never advised or solicited Jim to join him and said it was a low-down, mean, and ungrateful trick to betray him. He told Murphy plainly if he had anything to say it quickly. Barnes agreed with his chief and urged Murphy's death. The plotter denied any intention of betraying Bass and offered to take the lead in any robbery Bass should plan, and be the first to enter the express car or climb over the bank railing. Bass was mad, and so was Barnes. They elected to kill the liar at once. Frank Jackson had taken no part in the conversation, but he now declared he had known Murphy since he was a little boy, and he was sure Murphy was sincere and meant to stand by them through thick and thin. Bass was not satisfied and insisted that Murphy be murdered then and there. Jackson finally told Bass and Barnes that they could not kill Murphy without first killing him. Although the youngest of the party, Frank was only 22 years old, Jackson had great influence over his chief. He was brave and daring, and Bass at that time could not very well get along without him, so his counsel prevailed, and Murphy was spared. The bandits then determined to quit the country. Their plan was to rob a small bank somewhere en route to Old Mexico and thus secure the funds needed to facilitate their escape, for they were all broke. Bass, C.B. Barnes, Frank Jackson, and Jim Murphy left Denton County early in July 1878. With his usual boldness, Bass, after he had passed Dallas County, made no attempt at concealment, but traveled the public highway in broad daylight. Bass and Barnes were still suspicious of Murphy and never let him out of their sight, though they refused to talk to or to associate with him in any way. When Bass reached Waco, the party camped on the outskirts of the town and remained there 2 or 3 days. They visited the town each day, looked over the situation, and in one bank saw much gold and currency. Jackson was enthusiastic and wanted to rob it at once. Bass, being more careful and experienced, thought it too hazardous an undertaking, for the run through crowded streets to the outskirts of the city was too far, and so vetoed the attempt. While in Waco, the gang stepped into a saloon to get a drink. Bass laid a $20 gold piece on the bar and remarked, "There goes the last 20 of the Union Pacific money, and D and little good it has done me." On leaving Waco, the robbers stole a fine mare from a farmer named Billy Mounds and traveled the main road to Belton. They were now out of money and planned to rob the bank at Round Rock, Williamson County. General Jones was now getting anxious over the gang. Not a word had been heard from Jim Murphy since he had rejoined the band, for he had been so closely watched that he had had no opportunity to communicate with the authorities, and it seemed as if he would be forced to participate in the next robbery in spite of himself. At Belton, Sam sold an extra pony his party had after stealing the mare at Waco. The purchaser demanded a bill of sale, as the vendors were strangers in the country. While Bass and Barnes were in a store writing out the required document, Murphy seized the opportunity to dash off a short note to General Jones, saying, "We are on our way to Round Rock to rob the bank. For God's sake, be there to prevent it." As the post office adjoined the store, the traitor succeeded in mailing his letter of betrayal just 1 minute before Bass came out on the street again. The gang continued their way to Round Rock and camped near the Old Town, which is situated about 1 mile north of New Round Rock. The bandits concluded to rest and feed their horses for 3 or 4 days before attempting their robbery. This delay was providential, for it gave General Jones time to assemble his Rangers to repel the attack. After Major Jones was made Adjutant General of Texas, he caused a small detachment of 4 or 5 Rangers to camp on the Capitol grounds at Austin. He drew his units from different companies along the line. Each unit would be detailed to camp in Austin, and about every 6 weeks or 2 months, the detail would be relieved by a squad from another company. It will readily be seen that this was a wise policy, as the detail was always on hand and could be sent in any direction by rail or on horseback at short notice. Besides, General Jones was devoted to his Rangers and liked to have them around where he could see them daily. At the time, I wrote about 4 men from Company E, Corporal Vernon Wilson and Privates Dick Ware, Chris Connor, and George. Harold were camped at Austin. The corporal helped General Jones as a clerk in his office, but was in charge of the squad on the Capitol grounds, slept in camp, and had his meals with them. When General Jones received Murphy's letter, he was astonished at Bass's audacity in approaching within 15 or 20 miles of the state capitol, the very headquarters of the Frontier Battalion, to rob a bank. The letter was written at Belton, Texas, and received at the Adjutant General's office in the last mail in the afternoon. The company of Rangers nearest Round Rock was Lieutenant Reynolds's Company E, stationed at San Saba, 115 miles distant. There was no telegraph to San Saba then. General Jones reflected a few moments after receipt of the letter and then arranged his plan rapidly. He turned to Corporal Wilson and told him that Sam Bass and his gang were, or soon would be, at Round Rock, Texas, to rob the bank there. "I want you to leave at once to carry an order to Lieutenant Reynolds. It is 65 miles to Lampasas, and you can make that place early enough in the morning to catch the Lampasas and San Saba stage. You must make that stage at all hazards. Save neither yourself nor your horse. But get these orders to Lieutenant Reynolds as quickly as possible," he ordered. Corporal Wilson hurried to the livery stable, saddled his horse, and got away from Austin on his wild ride just at nightfall. His horse was fresh and fat and in no condition to make such a run. However, Wilson reached Lampasas at daylight the next morning and made the outgoing stage to San Saba, but killed his gallant little gray horse in the process. From Lampasas to San Saba was 50 miles, and it took the stage all day to make the trip. As soon as he landed in town, Corporal Wilson hired a horse and galloped 3 miles down to Lieutenant Reynolds's camp and delivered his orders. After dispatching Corporal Wilson to Lieutenant Reynolds, General Jones hurried over to the Ranger camp on the Capitol grounds and ordered the 3 Rangers, Ware, Connor, and Harold, to proceed to Round Rock, put their horses in Highsmith's livery stable, and keep themselves concealed until he could reach them himself by train next morning. The following morning, General Jones went to Round Rock. He carried with him from Austin Morris Moore, an ex-ranger but then deputy sheriff of Travis County. On reaching his destination, the general called on Deputy Sheriff Grimes of Williamson County, who was stationed at Round Rock, told him Bass was expected in town to rob the bank, and that a scout of Rangers would be in town as soon as possible. Jones advised Deputy Grimes to keep a sharp lookout for strangers, but on no account to attempt an arrest until the Rangers could arrive. I well remember the hot July evening when Corporal Wilson arrived in our camp with his orders. The company had just had supper, the horses fed and tied up for the night. We knew the sudden appearance of the corporal meant something of unusual importance. Soon Sergeant Neville came hurrying to us with orders to detail a party for an immediate scout. Lieutenant Reynolds's orders had been brief, but to the point. Bass is at Round Rock. We must be there as early as possible tomorrow. Make a detail of 8 men and select those that have the horses best able to make a fast run. And you, with them, report to me here at my tent, ready to ride, in 30 minutes. First Sergeant C. L. Neville, Second Sergeant Henry McGee, Second Corporal J. B. Gillett, Privates Abe Anglin, Dave Ligon, Bill Derrick, and John R. and W. L. Bannisters were selected for the detail. Lieutenant Reynolds ordered 2 of our best little pack mules hitched to a light spring hack, for he had been sick and was not in condition to make the journey horseback. In 30 minutes from the time Corporal Wilson reached camp, we were mounted, armed, and ready to go. Lieutenant Reynolds took his seat in the hack, threw some blankets in, and Corporal Wilson, who had not had a minute's sleep for over 36 hours, lay down to get a little rest as we moved along. Say, boys, did you ever try to follow on horseback 2 fast-traveling little mules hitched to an open-topped spring hack for 100 miles? Well, it is some stunt. We left our camp on the San Saba River just at sunset and traveled in a fast trot and sometimes in a loop the entire night. Our old friend and comrade, Jack Martin, then in the mercantile business at the little town of Centerfit, heard us pass by in the night, and next morning said to some of his customers that hell was to pay somewhere, as the Rangers had passed his store during the night on a dead run. The first rays of the rising sun shone on us at the crossing of North Gabriel, 15 miles south of Lampasas. We had ridden 65 miles that short summer night. We had 45 miles yet to go before reaching Round Rock. We halted on the Gabriel for breakfast of bread, broiled bacon, and black coffee. The horses had a bundle of oats each. Lieutenant Reynolds held his watch on us, and it took us just 30 minutes to breakfast and be off again. We were now facing a hot July sun, and our horses were beginning to show the effects of the hard ride of the night before and slowed down perceptibly. We never halted again until we reached the vicinity of Old Round Rock between 1 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon of Friday, July 19, 1878. The lieutenant camped us on the banks of Brushy Creek and drove into New Round Rock to report his arrival to General Jones. Bass had decided to rob the bank at Round Rock on Saturday, the 20th. After his gang had eaten dinner in camp, Friday evening they saddled their ponies and started over to town to take a last look at the bank and select a route to follow in leaving the place after the robbery. As they left camp, Jim Murphy, knowing that the bandits might be set upon at any time, suggested that he stop at May's store in Old Round Rock and get a bushel of corn, as they were out of feed for their horses. Bass, Barnes, and Jackson rode on into town, hitched their horses in an alley just back of the bank, past that building, and made a mental note of its situation. They then went up the main street of the town and entered Copperell's store to buy some tobacco. As the 3 bandits passed into the store, Deputy Sheriff Moore, who was standing on the sidewalk with Deputy Sheriff Grimes, said he thought one of the newcomers had a pistol. "I will go in and see," replied Grimes. "I believe you have a pistol," remarked Grimes, approaching Bass and trying to search him. "Yes, of course I have a pistol," said Bass. At the words, the robbers pulled their guns and killed Grimes as he backed away to the door. He fell dead on the sidewalk. They then turned on Moore and shot him through the lungs as he attempted to draw his weapon. At the crack of the first pistol shot, Dick Ware, who was seated in a barber shop only a few steps away, waiting his turn for a shave, rushed into the street and encountered the 3 bandits just as they were leaving the store. Seeing Ware rapidly advancing on them, Bass and his men fired on the Ranger at close range, one of their bullets striking a hitching post within 6 inches of Ware's head and knocking splinters into his face. This assault never halted Ware for an instant. He was as brave as courage itself, and never hesitated to take the most desperate chances when the occasion demanded it. For a few minutes Dick fought the robbers single-handed. General Jones, coming uptown from the telegraph office, ran into the fight. He was armed with only a small Colt's double-action pistol, but threw himself into the fray. Connor and Harold had now come up and joined in the fusillade. The general, seeing the robbers on foot and almost within his grasp, drew in close and urged his men to strain every nerve to capture or exterminate the desperadoes. By this time every man in the town that could secure a gun joined in the fight. The bandits had now reached their horses, and realizing their situation was critical, fought with the energy of despair. If ever a train robber could be called a hero, this boy, Frank Jackson, proved himself one. Barnes was shot down and killed at his feet. Bass was mortally wounded and unable to defend himself or even mount his horse while the bullets continued to pour in from every quarter. With heroic courage, Jackson held the Rangers back with his pistol in his right hand while he unhitched Bass's horse with his left and assisted him into the saddle. Then, mounting his own horse, Jackson and his chief galloped out of the jaws of hell itself. In their flight they passed through Old Round Rock, and Jim Murphy, standing in the door of May's store, saw Jackson and Bass go by on the dead run. The betrayer noticed that Jackson was holding Bass, pale and bleeding, in the saddle. Lieutenant Reynolds, entering Round Rock, came within 5 minutes of meeting Bass and Jackson on the road. Before he reached town, he met posses of citizens and rangers in pursuit of the robbers. When the fugitives reached the cemetery, Jackson halted long enough to secure a Winchester they had hidden in the grass there, then left the road and were lost for a time. The fight was now over, and the play spoiled by 2 overzealous deputies in bringing on an immature fight after they had been warned to be careful. Naturally, Moore and Grimes should have known that the 3 strangers were the Sam Bass gang. Lieutenant Reynolds started Sergeant Neville and his Rangers early next morning in search of the flying bandits. After traveling in the direction the robbers were last seen, we came upon a man lying under a large oak tree. Seeing we were armed as we advanced upon him, he called out to us not to shoot, saying he was Sam Bass, the man we were hunting. After entering the woods the evening before, Bass became so sick and faint from loss of blood that he could go no farther. Jackson dismounted and wanted to stay with his chief, declaring he was a match for all their pursuers. "No, Frank," replied Bass, "I am done for." The wounded leader told his companion to tie his horse near at hand so he could get away if he felt better during the night. Jackson was finally prevailed upon to leave Bass and make his own escape. When daylight came Saturday morning, Bass got up and walked to a nearby house. As he approached the place, a lady, seeing him coming, holding his pants up and all covered with blood, left her house and started to run off, as she was alone with a small servant girl. Bass saw she was frightened and called to her to stop, saying he was perishing for a drink of water and would return to a tree not far away and lie down if she would only send him a drink. The lady sent him a quart cup of water, but the poor fellow was too far gone to drink it. We found him under this tree 1 hour later. He had a wound through the center of his left hand, the bullet having pierced the middle finger. Bass's death wound was given to him by Dick Ware, who used a .45 caliber Colt's long-barrel 6-shooter. The ball from Ware's pistol struck Bass's belt and cut 2 cartridges in pieces and entered his back just above the right hip bone. The bullet badly mushroomed and made a fearful wound that tore the victim's right kidney all to pieces. From the moment he was shot until his death 3 days later, Bass suffered untold agonies. As he lay on the ground Friday night where Jackson had left him, the wounded man tore his undershirt into more than 100 pieces and wiped the blood from his body. Bass was taken to Round Rock and given the best of medical attention, but died the following day, Sunday, July 21st, 1878. While he was yet able to talk, General Jones appealed to Bass to reveal to the state authorities the names of the Confederates he had had, that they might be apprehended. "Sam, you have done much evil in this world, and have only a few hours to live. Now, While you have a chance to do the state some good, please tell me who your associates were in those violations of the laws of your country." Sam replied that he could not betray his friends and that he might as well die with what he knew in him. Sam Bass was buried in the cemetery at Old Round Rock. A small monument was erected over his grave by a sister. Its simple inscription reads, "Samuel Bass, born July 21, 1851, died July 21, 1878. A brave man reposes in death here. Why was he not true? Frank Jackson made his way back into Denton County and hung around some time hoping to get an opportunity to murder the betrayer of his chief, an ingrate whose cause he himself had so ably championed. Jackson declared if he could meet Jim Murphy, he would kill him, cut off his head, and carry it away in a gunny sack. Murphy returned to Denton, but learned that Jackson was hiding in the elm bottoms, awaiting a chance to slay him. He thereupon asked permission of the sheriff to remain about the jail for protection. While skulking about the prison, one of his eyes became infected. A physician gave him some medicine to drop into the diseased eye, at the same time cautioning him to be careful as the fluid was a deadly poison. Murphy drank the entire contents of the bottle and was dead in a few hours. Remorse, no doubt, caused him to end his life. Of the 4 men that fought the Round Rock battle with Sam Bass and his gang, all are dead: General J.B. Jones and Rangers R.C. Ware, Chris Connor, and George Harold. Of the 10 men that made the long ride from San Saba to Round Rock, only 2 are now alive: Lieutenant N.O. Reynolds and myself.